Many are surprised that the EU Commission has achieved so little in the trade talks with the USA. The complaint everywhere is that they should have been bolder and threatened with countermeasures. How could it be accepted that the Americans impose tariffs and the Europeans simply do nothing? Are the Europeans scaredy cats? Anyone who thinks this way knows nothing about international trade and judges as if both sides could easily have met as equals. This is a mistake. There can be no question of a level playing field. But this is not only due to the sheer power of the Americans, it is also due to the logic of the matter. You only have to compare the two documents that have appeared on both sides to find out. The magic word is balanced trade. The American fact sheet states, the United States and the European Union have concluded a cooperation agreement on reciprocal, fair, and balanced trade. The European counterpart document reads, on July 27, 2025, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and U.S. President Donald J. Trump reached an agreement on tariffs and trade. There is not a word about balanced and fair trade. Because the discrepancy between the documents is so obvious, I can tell you exactly how the negotiations went. I wasn't there, but logic tells us what it must have been like. The American delegation enters the negotiating room, throws a picture on the wall showing the current account balances of the USA and Europe. The USA has huge deficits. Europe has large surpluses. The American negotiator says, it's quite simple. We have deficits. You have surpluses. We want balanced trade. Balanced trade, he says literally. But what do you want? Ursula von der Leyen stares at her talking paper, but can't find an answer. Yes, what do the Europeans want? Should she now say that the Europeans want another 100 years of surpluses? What can be said against balanced trade? Aren't the Europeans themselves trying to achieve balanced trade in the monetary union? Aren't there even procedures and accusations against countries that constantly have too high surpluses? Perhaps the Americans know this. Before the president of the commission can even open her mouth, the American says, as intelligent people and good economists, we all agree that mercantilism, the attempt by countries and regions to enrich themselves through constant trade surpluses at the expense of their trading partners, belongs in the dustbin of history. After all, we have known this for 300 years. That sits well. The president of the commission has still not said a word, but is now standing up and stammering. But please, number 30%. 15% isn't bad either if we make an effort to accommodate our American friends in other areas. Fine, says the American, let's do 15%, a few $100 billion in direct investment, a few $100 billion more in energy imports, and the deal is done. The president of the commission thanks the Americans for this generous gesture between friends and asks them to pass on their best wishes to Donald. The Americans leave the room, chuckle, and say that it has never been so easy to leave the Europeans speechless. I fear that, even after this lesson, most Europeans will still not understand what has happened. They think mercantilism is a word used to insult those who are against free trade. But only balanced trade can be fair trade. Those who constantly have surpluses are undoubtedly the culprits. Incidentally, the president of the Swiss Confederation had the same fate as the president of the Commission. She also thought she was well prepared for a phone call with Donald Trump and was coldly dismissed. The Europeans, in their excess mania, do not realize that they have no argument against the American accusation of mercantilism. You cannot simply confront a powerful partner and say, we simply want surpluses because we have always had surpluses. In order to avoid the tariffs, the surplus countries should have joined forces and offered the Americans to reduce the surpluses in a mutually beneficial way, namely through more growth in the surplus countries. However, the relevant economic expertise to develop such a strategy is evidently lacking in all the administrations involved. When the global financial crisis threatened to trigger a conflagration in the EU in 2007-08, the firefighters were quickly deployed. The member states initially used one extinguishing tool in particular, extensive deficit spending. In order to stabilize their economies and banking systems, they primarily resorted to economic stimulus programs and rescue packages. This was because the crisis of confidence among banks and their customers, triggered by large numbers of bad loans on their balance sheets, weakened lending. However, this is essential for investment in the real economy. With government deficit spending, Europeans converted private liabilities from bank balance sheets into public debt. In Germany, measures such as the car scrappage scheme also stabilized overall economic demand. As a result, the public debt of EU member states increased. As a general rule, the more severely the EU member states were affected by the financial crisis, the greater the increase in government debt. While Ireland and the southern European periphery, Greece, Spain, and Portugal, were affected by both the financial crisis and an increase in public debt ratios, this development was much less pronounced in the center of the EU, with Germany and the Benelux countries. As the member states frequently violated the Maastricht criteria from the founding documents, maximum public debt ratio of 60% and annual new debt of 3% of GDP, the EU entered a new phase of crisis management from spring 2010. Interestingly, the community of states not only implemented an austerity policy reform agenda, as was the focus according to political scientist Hans-Jürgen Bieling. The EU also integrated this into a larger macroeconomic management framework. This resulted in a shift of steering competencies from the national to the European level and a tendency to curtail national scope for action, as political scientists Thomas Ablowski, Etienne Schneider, and Felix Sirivaka put it. The EU therefore seemed to be well aware that the euro crisis was also an expression of the unequal development between the member states. In other words, the unequal impact of the financial crisis and the varying degrees of increase in national debt ratios. Its solution was more integration and less autonomy for the nation-states. To this end, it adopted various instruments, including the Troika, May 2010, and Quadriga, July 2015, the Euro Plus Pact, March 2011, the European Semester, November 2011, the Six-Pack, December 2011, and the Fiscal Compact, January 2013. As can be seen from the following chart, the Six-Pack not only contains 4 pieces of legislation on budget consolidation. The last 2 regulations also address so-called macroeconomic imbalances. By macroeconomic imbalances, the EU Statistics Authority Eurostat means all trends leading to macroeconomic developments that have or could potentially have an adverse effect on the orderly functioning of the economy of a member state or the economic and monetary union or the union as a whole. But when does an economy function properly and when does it not? This question can only be answered normatively. It is necessary to set generally binding standards for the proper functioning of EU economies and make them measurable. The EU has developed a scoreboard for this purpose, which is regularly updated and adapted. The scoreboard measures the proper functioning of the EU economies using 13 key indicators in 6 blocks: foreign trade, competitiveness, public and private debt, financial sector, housing market, employment, and social indicators. The European Commission supplements the scoreboard with 23 so-called auxiliary indicators. According to Eurostat, these should enable a better understanding of the risks and facilitate the identification of relevant policy measures. The change in real GDP, the employment rate, 3-year change in the population aged 15 to 64, and other auxiliary indicators are included in the scoreboard. What is striking about the headline indicators is that the units and threshold values are very heterogeneous. Sometimes the reference value of the unit is GDP. Then again, there is no reference value, and instead the 3-year average or the 3-year/5-year change counts. Similarly, the threshold values. Sometimes there are both lower and upper threshold values, then only a lower or an upper one. Sometimes different threshold values apply for the Eurozone and EU countries. Then the unit of measurement is percent or percentage points. To understand why the units and thresholds are so heterogeneous, it is worth taking a look at the European Commission's Occasional Paper Scoreboard for the Surveillance of Macroeconomic Imbalances, 2012. Since the introduction of the macroeconomic imbalance procedure, the Commission has also added indicators and threshold values and adapted existing ones. It has explained its approach in publications, often quite succinctly. These follow-up publications are therefore also worth a look. There is not enough space here to refer to all the justifications. Therefore, only those variables that affect the balance of payments, current account balance, net foreign assets as consolidated balance of payments, and export performance vis-a-vis developed economies. In 2013, the European Commission introduced the new indicator export performance vis-a-vis advanced economies. The reasoning: the rise of emerging economies would have led to losses in the market shares of EU member states. However, the theoretical justification for the indicator does not harmonize with the statistical selection. Instead of comparing the export performance of EU states with a selected number of emerging countries, China, in particular, which was able to increase its global export share from 3.9% 2000 to 14.5% 2024, would be relevant here. The European Commission opted for the member states of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD. The European Commission did not set a threshold value for export performance vis-a-vis advanced economies until December 2024. While no upper threshold was defined for whatever reason, the lower threshold is a 3-year change of -3%. Justification: the change corresponds to the lower quartile of the EU 27 data distribution between 1995 and 2022. An empirical finding from the past is therefore set as a target for the future without justification. In other words, what happened in the past should continue to happen in the future. A naturalistic fallacy par excellence. In contrast to the export market share, the current account balance not only has a lower threshold value of -4% of GDP, but also an upper threshold value of 6% of GDP. This is paradoxical, because the current account balance includes exports of goods and services, which are usually the main reason for surpluses or deficits. So why is there no upper threshold value in an isolated analysis of exports compared to developed economies? And why is there one when the other components of the current account balance, primary and secondary income, are added to exports? This is incomprehensible without further explanation, which the Commission does not provide. As in the case of exports, it sets a statistical observation as the normative standard for the upper and lower limits of the current account balance. In the occasional paper, it derives the indicative threshold of -4% from a data sample that begins in the early/mid-1990s for most of the old member states and ends in 2007 for the new member states. The upper threshold of 6% corresponds to the upper quartile of the distribution of the 3-year backward average of the current account balance, 2%, plus a margin of 4%. The margin would be in line with the so-called smart symmetry approach, which allows unequal thresholds if they are theoretically justified. In this case, the Commission considers deficits to be less sustainable than surpluses, as their spillover effect, the spillover of deficits from one EU member state to one or more other member states, is greater. As usual, there is no theoretical justification for this alleged correlation. However, this would be absolutely necessary, as the ECB justifies the inclusion of the current account balance as the main indicator in the scoreboard by stating that it is one of the most common statistically significant indicators to explain the occurrence of crises. The Commission only derives crisis severity for current account deficits and not for surpluses. According to a study by IMF authors Swati Ghosh and Adish Ghosh, countries with a current account deficit of over 2.5% of GDP would be 7 times more likely to experience a crisis than countries with a lower deficit. The authors of the study themselves emphasize that the vulnerability thresholds depend heavily on the particular combination of institutional, macroeconomic, and corporate governance/financial structure indicators, and each country must be assessed taking these indicators into account. In the Akashian paper above, the Commission does point out that it has agreed with the Parliament and the Council to duly take into account additional information for the economic interpretation of the current account, in particular the particularities of catching-up economies. However, this once again raises the question of a systematic approach. The European Commission has defined 3 auxiliary indicators in the area of foreign trade: net foreign assets excluding instruments not at risk of default, net borrowing/lending, current transactions plus capital account, and net trade balance of energy products. But are they sufficient to do justice to a complex analysis as required by the Ghoshs? The foreign trade auxiliary indicators also only relate to foreign trade, although the Ghoshs also take into account domestic indicators, such as gross domestic product and even a corruption index. But even if they were sufficient, it would still remain open why the Commission does not set the lower threshold at minus 2.5%, but at minus 4%, and thus apparently considers the findings from the extensive IMF study to be less important than a contingent statistical distribution among the EU member states. The current account balance is followed by the net international investment position as the counterpart to the current account balance, according to the Commission in the occasional paper above. In accounting terms, changes in real transactions, exports and imports of goods, services, income, and transfers result in a current account balance and the flow of financial transactions, direct investment, portfolio investment, financial derivatives, currency reserves, as well as bank loans and deposits, result in a financial account balance. Added together and including valuation and exchange rate effects, the two balances provide information on the change in net foreign assets. As a rule, the status of net foreign assets is primarily dependent on the current account balance, as its share is usually far greater than that of the financial account balance. If the current account balance falls, the net foreign position also decreases. Despite this close correlation between the current account balance and net foreign assets, there is only a lower threshold for the net international investment position, in contrast to the current account balance, minus 35% of GDP. In this case, the Commission does not a priori regard foreign asset positions as problematic for a member state or the functioning of the Economic and Monetary Union, EMU. We only learn that the minus 35% of GDP results from analysis of balance of payment statistics from the EU statistics portal Eurostat, but not how it was calculated, let alone against what theoretical background it was determined. It is surprising that the Commission has chosen a concrete value at all, because, according to the authors of the occasional paper, it is difficult to determine a level of net foreign assets that is considered risky. Once again, the Commission has to admit that it is not enough to look at a key indicator alone. Additional relevant information must be taken into account, including which liabilities require the repayment of capital or interest and which liabilities are not debt-forming. It is also important to take into account that catching-up economies have a high inflow of foreign direct investment and represent a less risky and more stable form of financing than other alternatives. Thankfully, the Commission also provides a consideration to refute this argument. In a footnote, it draws attention to the fact that foreign direct investment can also flow out of the country. This would particularly affect non-distributed profits. Taking this idea to its logical conclusion, the degree of risk is less dependent on the amount of net foreign liabilities, but much more on the strategic corporate decisions of investors. In concrete terms, this means the extent to which the management wishes to concentrate capital flows abroad or bring them back to the country of origin. Only the net international investment position, excluding instruments not at risk of default, has made it into the list of auxiliary indicators of net foreign assets without a threshold value. An auxiliary indicator for foreign direct investments, which at best estimates the degree of security of direct investments in terms of corporate strategy, is not included. Overall, it is clear that the European Commission is making blatant mistakes in the construction of the leading indicators in the area of foreign trade. It derives the main indicators in a theoretically incoherent manner, determines headline indicators from statistical distributions instead of comprehensively from economic impact correlations, sometimes determines upper and lower limits, or sometimes only the lower limit in an incomprehensible manner, and supports headline indicators with inadequately designed auxiliary indicators, if the necessary ones have made it onto the scoreboard at all. The consequences of this arbitrary construction can be seen in the context of the so-called European semester. Based on the scoreboard, the European Commission draws up an alert mechanism report in the fall of each year. The Commission proposes countries that show anomalies in the scoreboard, which is particularly the case when lower or upper thresholds are exceeded, for an in-depth review. In spring, the Commission draws up so-called country-specific recommendations, taking into account other factors, economic size of the country, context of the overshoot, trends, previous procedures, etc., which contain political guidelines for the individual member states in advance of their national budgetary procedures. These recommendations often address precisely those areas in which a country exceeds one or more thresholds. European Union recommendations focus on making existing regulations on labor market and wage conditions more flexible. As Sirivaka points out, the EU issued labor market policy recommendations for 21 EU member states, aimed at either decentralizing wage setting, deregulating labor law, lowering the minimum wage or moderate wage development, or reforming unemployment insurance. Based on country-specific recommendations, the program countries must submit a corrective action plan with concrete structural policy measures and deadlines for their implementation. The Commission intensifies monitoring of the program country by requesting regular progress reports. If a program country does not submit a satisfactory corrective action plan or repeatedly fails to implement the agreed measures, a regulation of the European Parliament and the Council allows fines of up to 0.1% of the member state's GDP. Even if the procedure has never gone so far as to impose fines, the steps taken show how serious the Commission is about its imbalanced procedure. A scoreboard with arbitrarily constructed indicators and threshold values becomes the basis for a procedure that intervenes deeply in national economic and financial policy, where it focuses on making labor market and wage relations more flexible. As long as the member states comply with the EU Commission's procedure, there will be no fines. More important, however, is the question of the extent to which relevant decision-makers in the EU member states are aware of the crumbling foundations of the EU's internal structural adjustment program. To what extent would they continue to adapt their economic and financial policies to the Commission's guidelines if, for example, there is a growing awareness that the threshold values are not based on sound knowledge of macroeconomic correlations, but simply on past statistical distributions? The skirmish between Trump and Musk overshadows another conflict in which the president is involved, even if it is at least as politically explosive as the first. It concerns disputes with Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell over the interest rate policy of the Federal Reserve Fed. Trump has been calling for interest rate cuts to stimulate the economy since the beginning of the year. Powell is holding out against this, until now. In May, the Fed decided to leave its interbank federal funds rate, often referred to as the key interest rate, at 4.5% for the third time in a row. Powell justified this even more clearly than at the last interest rate decision in March with macroeconomic uncertainties associated with Trump's tariff policy. Critics see Trump's insistence on interest rate cuts as a violation of a central bank principle, the independence of the federal. Even though the head of the European Central Bank, ECB, Christine Lagarde, did not explicitly comment on the matter, her words at the end of January left little doubt that she is one of those critics. At an event organized by the Hungarian Central Bank, she announced that the real independence of central banks is being called into question in several parts of the world. Political pressure would influence the volatility of exchange rates, bond yields, and risk premiums. It is hardly surprising that such words should come from the ECB president. As with its institutional role model, the Bundesbank, independence is also central to the ECB. The Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, TFEU, which is part of the EU's primary law that is binding under international law, states, when exercising the powers and carrying out the tasks and duties conferred upon them by the treaties and the statute of the ESCB and of the ECB, neither the European Central Bank, nor a national central bank, nor any member of their decision-making body shall seek or take instructions from union institutions, bodies, offices, or agencies, from any government of a member state or from any other body. Article 130 TFEU. EU primary law, therefore, immunizes the ECB against instructions from outside. But what does this mean in concrete terms? There are at least three areas of independence: price policy, personnel policy, and financial policy. Independence does not mean that the ECB can set its objectives arbitrarily. Rather, EU primary law establishes a framework within which the ECB can develop concrete measures to achieve an abstractly formulated objective. For example, Article 127(1) of the TFEU states that the European System of Central Banks, ESCB, has the primary objective of price stability. According to the Governing Council of the ECB, this can best be achieved by aiming for an inflation rate of 2% over the medium term. And further, this target is symmetrical i.e. negative deviations from this target are just as undesirable as positive ones. The inflation rate is measured by the rate of change in the Consumer Price Index, which is based on a basket of weighted goods and services that are relevant to everyday life. The Consumer Price Index should therefore not remain constant, but rather rise by 2% in the medium term. In the past, central banks tried to control the money supply in order to achieve an inflation target. However, when they realized that they had little success with this, they changed their strategy. Today, inflation expectations play a decisive role for the ECB, writes the central bank on its website. As socioeconomist Gunther Grunert notes, the concept of inflation expectations is a relic of Milton Friedman-style monetarism. In his work, The Optimum Quantity of Money, Friedman assumes that prices do not rise due to market imbalances, but because every market participant confidently expects prices to rise. Accordingly, economic agents would adjust their price-relevant behavior in line with their expectations and thus lower or raise prices. The ECB therefore interprets its mandate for price stability primarily as a communicative task for the 2% target. The ECB usually cites trade unions and employers' associations as relevant addressees. The common message from the Eurozone Central Bank: if we raise interest rates, this will produce unemployment, which is why you should rein in your wage increases. This would limit the pressure on wage costs for companies and thus also their incentives to raise prices. The problem with this is that not only is the threat a toothless tiger, the empirical link between interest rates and investment, and therefore also the need for labor, is rather tenuous. But the collective bargaining parties must also interpret these signals in the post-monetarist logic of the ECB. If they fail to do so, and according to Grunert, recent studies in particular point to discrepancies between the interpretations of experts and the majority of society, the ECB will quickly reach the end of its tether. And even if trade unions interpret the central bank's communication as intended, it is questionable whether they can always behave as desired by the ECB in wage negotiations. If, for example, the ECB communicates that it wants to counter deflationary tendencies by lowering the key interest rate, the main refinancing rate in the Eurozone, trade unions, especially in poorly organized sectors, will hardly have sufficient negotiating power to bring about a significant increase in wages and inflation. As with pricing policy, the EU's primary law also guarantees independence in terms of personnel. However, this only concerns the operational independence of the Executive Board. Its appointment is made by the European Council, i.e. the body of heads of state or government, in accordance with Article 283(2) TFEU. It elects the president of the ECB, its vice president, and other members of the executive board by qualified majority. The Council of Ministers, in this case the finance ministers of the member states, makes a recommendation for this after having to consult the European Parliament and the Governing Council of the European Central Bank. According to the TFEU, only persons of recognized standing and professional experience in monetary and banking matters may be considered as members of the executive board. However, once appointed, two provisions in particular ensure the continuity of the members of the executive board. Firstly, their term of office is 8 years, which is quite a bit longer than usual terms in EU bodies, such as members of the European Parliament, legislative term, 5 years. Secondly, the members of the executive board can hardly be dismissed during this term of office. The statute of the ECB and the European system of central banks, also a building block of EU primary law, states that a member of the executive board can only be dismissed if he no longer fulfills the conditions required for the performance of his duties or has been guilty of serious misconduct. Article 11.4 Statute ECB/ECB. Which conditions and serious misconduct may be involved here requires interpretation, such as that provided by the laws of the member states or EU law. If these legal interpretations ensure personal persistence, they also create a solid basis for ensuring independence. This is because as long as members of the executive board can hardly be legally prosecuted for their monetary policy decisions, it tends to increase their willingness to take unpopular measures. The ECB proved its financial independence, particularly during the euro crisis. Through the comprehensive purchase of government and corporate bonds, or Just the announcement of this, as in the case of Mario Draghi's outright monetary transactions program, whatever it takes, it has managed to stabilize the financial system in the Eurozone. It has acted as the lender of last resort for banks, companies, and countries. During the Euro crisis and the Corona crisis, the ECB repeatedly provided monetary policy support to countries that were struggling with rising risk premiums. As its statutes prevented it from using the primary market, it had to buy up government bonds on the secondary market. During the energy crisis, it expanded its scope for monetary policy by purchasing government bonds using the Transmission Protection Instrument, TPI, the targeted purchase of debt instruments from individual Euro countries, especially when spreads, interest rate differences between countries, were rising, showed that the ECB was not only providing acute assistance, as it did during the Euro and Corona crises, but was also taking preventative action. It proved to be the lender of last resort for banks, particularly during the financial crisis from 2007 onwards, when banks' confidence in each other dwindled due to the inflated market for bad loans. The ECB stepped in to provide liquidity. Between 2011 and 2015 in particular, it accepted structured products or loan portfolios as collateral, including securitized receivables that were bloated with bad loans and therefore had no other buyers on the market. The ECB has only been supporting companies that are not banks and insurance companies since 2016. In order to improve its financing conditions, it agreed to buy corporate bonds with a credit rating of at least BBB-. As a study by the New Economics Foundation shows, the ECB has bought up almost 1,500 corporate bonds with a volume of over 1 billion euros. The focus was on large and established issuers with high credit ratings such as Volkswagen AG, NLSBA, Energy Giant, and LVMH, leading luxury goods manufacturer. The necessary sovereignty for the bond purchase programs via the secondary market stems from the statutes of the ECB and the ECB board. It states, in order to achieve the objectives of the ESCB and to carry out its tasks, the ECB and the national central banks may operate in the financial markets by buying and selling outright, spot or forward, or under repurchase agreements claims and negotiable securities and precious metals denominated in community or non-community currencies, or by entering into corresponding lending operations. Art. 18.1 Statute ECB/ECSB. Nevertheless, German stakeholders attempted to bring a constitutional action against the ECB because they were of the opinion that it was exceeding its mandate by purchasing public bonds. Prominent plaintiffs include AfD founder Bernd Lucke and former CSU member of the Bundestag Peter Gauweiler. Although the Federal Constitutional Court ruled in their favor, the proceedings had no consequences for the ECB, as German law is subordinate to European law in the hierarchy of norms. Germany, on the other hand, was subject to infringement proceedings by the European Commission, which were discontinued in December 2021 without a public statement of reasons. The government bond purchase programs in particular have historically shown that the independence of the central bank encourages arbitrary decisions. While it denied Greece a loan during the financial crisis in order to force the Tsipras government to implement an austerity program, for example, it bought Greek bonds during the coronavirus pandemic and thus improved the Hellenes' refinancing conditions. Independence, therefore, in no way means that the ECB acts neutrally or apolitically. This can certainly be seen in the devastating consequences of the refusal to support Greece with monetary policy in 2015 in order to implement the draconian austerity program. Unemployment skyrocketed, wages collapsed, as did gross domestic product. The result was a far-reaching loss of prosperity. It is true that Greece's key macroeconomic indicators also deteriorated during the coronavirus pandemic, particularly due to the lack of tourism. However, the country was not forced to introduce additional austerity programs, which would have had a pro-cyclical effect on the recession. Voices that want to restrict the ECB sovereignty in order to prevent questionable decisions, such as those in the Greek crisis through democratic channels, should be warned. Unlike the Bundesbank in the days of the Deutschmark, the ECB's independence is not regulated by individual laws, but is anchored in the EU's primary law. While it would have been possible to end the independence of the Bundesbank by a majority vote in the Bundestag, if necessary with the approval of the Bundesrat, The independence of the ECB could only be abolished by an ordinary amendment procedure with the approval of all EU member states. Democracy-promoting reforms that restrict or abolish the independence of the ECB are therefore associated with significantly greater hurdles than before. The ECB is firmly in the saddle. It was the elephant in the European room when former ECB President Mario Draghi published a study on the future of the European Union's competitiveness in mid-September last year. It is actually an open secret that the EU has been losing economic strength to the USA for some time. All that was missing was an important person to address the issue. And Draghi did so relentlessly. In his report, he called for unprecedented investment in order to overcome existential challenges. He said that decarbonization, digitalization, and defense could only be achieved at the same time with an annual, earmarked new EU debt of 750 to 800 billion euros, or around 4.4 to 4.7% of total gross domestic product, GDP. For years, the upturn following the financial and euro crisis concealed fundamental problems in the European Union: low unemployment, more women in the labor market, and the success of EU exporters in emerging markets made the neoliberal dogma appear much more resilient than it actually is. What was accepted for too long? A growing gap in the EU's productivity statistics compared to the USA since the end of the 1990s. The proposals in Draghi's report The Future of European Competitiveness are radical in view of the EU's relative lack of growth. Unprecedented investment is required to overcome this existential challenge. This is the only way to achieve decarbonization, digitalization, and defense at the same time. Draghi sees the following 3 points as key. The European gap to U.S. competitors in terms of innovation and productivity must be closed. Since the mid-1990s, the USA's lead over Europe has been widening, partly and especially due to technological innovations, which are seen as drivers of productivity. Energy prices and climate targets are closely linked and must develop a better synergy. Due to the reduced gas supply, prices in the manufacturing sector have risen massively. However, while the EU is lagging behind in digital technologies, it is leading the way in green energy production, wind, hydrogen, batteries, biofuels. The resulting potential for reducing energy prices and emissions should be tapped into in a coordinated strategy so that Europe's competitive advantage in this sector increases at the same time. In the short term, however, trade with China, the largest producer of solar cells, should be considered as an advantageous route. The EU is geopolitically dependent, above all on raw material and gas suppliers, and militarily exposed. This poses economic uncertainties and a latent security risk. Draghi calls for trade agreements with resource-rich countries to be coordinated at EU level and for the fragmented defense industry complex to be standardized in order to ensure efficiency and interoperability. According to Draghi, the EU member states should finance the transformation processes through earmarked new debt of 750 to 800 billion euros per year. This corresponds to around 4.4 to 4.7% of total European GDP. The Marshall Plan from 1948 to 1951 only provided for 1 to 2% annually. The first and so far last time that loans were raised on the capital markets on a comparable scale was the Corona Reconstruction Fund. The idea had already failed once before in 2012 under the name Eurobonds and mainly due to Germany's energetic resistance. Not even 3 hours had passed since the publication of the Draghi report, and resistance from Germany was once again voiced. This time, it was Finance Minister Christian Lindner who vehemently objected to the collective debt of the EU states. While Economics Minister Robert Habeck has a more open position than the Finance Minister, Lindner's reluctance is sparked by the joint liability for European government bonds. The higher the national share of the EU budget, the greater the liability for the respective member state, and of course, by taking on new debt in general. As the country with the highest gross national income, Germany has the largest share of the EU budget. So is it true, as various media and economists already claimed during the Euro crisis? Sooner or later, the southern states will default on their debts and Germany's taxpayers will bear the corresponding additional costs. Even back then, This narrative was characterized more by neoliberal dogmas than by realistic assumptions. This is because the EU member states take on debt by issuing government bonds, which the so-called bank bidders among the commercial banks buy with central bank book money. The central bank is the sole issuer of this type of money. No EU private household has access to it, because citizens only have claims to bank money at the commercial banks where they are customers. No private individual has an account with the central bank or, in the case of a euro country, with one of its branches, Bundesbank, Banca d'Italia, etc. From this perspective of two money circuits, public central bank money and private bank money, concerns about the direct burden on the taxpayer can be dispelled, but Draghi's proposals still face institutional obstacles. The slow and disaggregated political decision-making process in the European Union, Draghi, cannot be argued away using monetary theory. This is because the institutional structure of the EU practically prevents a clear formulation of objectives, the coordination of agreed projects, and a common industrial policy. In order to remove political hurdles, Draghi believes that qualified majority decisions are needed, which would be extended to more processes within the EU. This would enable the Union to act more quickly. Draghi concludes that this would put a stop to the blocking attitude of individual states. Regulatory requirements for companies would also have to undergo a precise cost-benefit evaluation in order to prevent unnecessary burdens, according to Draghi. So far, however, only the standard cost model exists as a guideline. Stronger growth of the EU economy is necessary, but this growth should not be forced for its own sake. However, Draghi's tone is characterized by this idea in places. Of course, the common GDP can be increased if there is a financial stimulus, but the focus must be on real values, which must be built up gradually. The negative consequences of the fixation on GDP growth became apparent in the United Kingdom in the 1960s. This was due to the OECD's reorientation towards rapid growth and the liberalization of the financial markets. 50% growth was to be achieved in the decade 1960 to 1970. With the Code of Liberalization of Capital Movements, the OECD opened up the country to international capital flows. The high and sustainable economic development of the 1950s needed to be boosted even further. The United Kingdom had to grow at all costs. When the OECD set this target, the UK had almost full employment. In the 1950s, the government used an active monetary and fiscal policy to combat inflation and unemployment and to support stable economic development. This stability was sacrificed for turbo growth. However, the problems that then became virulent in the 1970s became apparent as early as the 1960s. Despite rising GDP, the profitability of private industrial companies fell. In 1967, the pound was devalued in order to strengthen international competitiveness. Because investors were now betting against the pound on the financial markets, a series of restrictive fiscal policy measures were enacted to weaken the purchasing power of the population and thus reduce the volume of imports. This helped fuel the recession and the rise of Thatcherism in the 1970s. Substantial and regular investment in education and technology at EU level, where private and national investment is far too low, is necessary. In this respect, Draghi is to be agreed with. However, there is a hidden side note in the Draghi report that should make Germany in particular sit up and take notice. A more systematic issuance of such assets, EU bonds, editor's note, would, however, require stricter fiscal rules to ensure that an increase in common debt is accompanied by a more sustainable development of national public debt. It would therefore not only be necessary to take into account the fiscal rules of the member states, which are much stricter than the Maastricht criterion, at least in Germany. The debt ratios of the individual member states are also usually higher than the upper limit of 60% of GDP set out in the European fiscal rules. More than half of the member states exceed the EU debt limit. This is particularly problematic for EU member states with a high gross national income. The EU countries with the strongest economies, such as Germany, 63.6%, but above all France, 110.7%, and Italy, 137.3%, exceed the debt ceiling. These countries could contribute a great deal to Draghi's economic stimulus program as a proportion of the EU's overall economic strength, but at the same time have to reduce their national debt, in some cases considerably, due to national and European fiscal rules. This means that as long as the EU does not relax the national fiscal rules, at least for the highly indebted, mostly large member states, contrary to Draghi's demand, the volume of the economic stimulus program will be very limited. Draghi's economic stimulus program, which, as a reminder, is more than twice as large as the Marshall Plan, can hardly be implemented, if at all. However, as so often in the past, Germany's resistance threatens to nip Draghi's fiscal policy initiative in the bud. You would think that when a respected person like Draghi makes his demands with such emphasis, great deeds would follow. But the Italian no longer holds any office in the EU, and so he lacks the formal institutional means of power to enforce the implementation of his investment program. What remains? Warm words from EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and a task force to implement concrete proposals and possible legislation, according to the Springer medium Politico, citing statements from two EU representatives. If you don't know what to do, set up a task force, or if you don't want to. In the inaugural speech of her second term of office, von der Leyen explicitly emphasized that the European Commission will use Draghi's report as a compass throughout its mandate. Therefore, public investment will play a decisive role for her. However, under von der Leyen, it is not so much the level of public investment that is the problem, but rather the lack of prioritization in the EU budget. In other words, investments are to be reallocated instead of taking on new debt. Draghi, however, is explicitly calling for new debt for his extensive growth program. The Task Force for the Development of Policy Recommendations based on Draghi's report is therefore faced with the impossible task of fulfilling von der Leyen's premise of a commission of investment without the Commission President granting extensive opportunities for new debt. There is no lack of capital. It would now also be possible for Draghi's investment offensive to primarily mobilize private funds. Although public investment would then no longer play the desired decisive role, the objective would still be achieved in quantitative terms, a blessing for the task force. And von der Leyen seems to implicitly prefer this approach, even though she advocated the primacy of public investment in her inauguration speech. It appears to be no more than lip service. Because when it comes to who should invest, she only focuses on the private sector. She envisions a savings and investment union for the private sector so that European companies can find the capital they need here in Europe. This capital markets union would close the capital gap between the EU on the one hand and the USA and China on the other. But how promising is such a financialization strategy? A recent paper by BSW MEP Fabio De Masi and economist Dirk Entz raises doubts. The two counter the Commission's initiative for a capital markets union by arguing that corporate investments in the union do not fail due to a lack of financial resources, but primarily due to a lack of demand. They show this by means of an econometric comparison with the USA. While the EU was still the leader in real gross fixed capital formation, excluding residential construction investment, as a proportion of GDP from 2000 to 2010, its pioneering role was reversed from 2010 onwards. The authors consider it unlikely that monetary policy is to blame for this, and that a capital market union could therefore provide a remedy, given the development of the effective interest rates of the ECB and federal. Despite the reversal of the investment advantage from 2010, nominal interest rates have almost always been higher in the USA than in the Eurozone from 1998 to the present day. So why were investments only higher in the EU until 2010, when lower interest rates are supposed to stimulate investment activity? According to De Masi and Entz, private investment is relatively sluggish in relation to interest rates. They make the assumption that companies are to a certain extent able to pass on increased interest costs to their customers and will therefore invest when demand is high, even if interest rates are high. Conversely, according to the two authors, a lower interest rate will hardly cause a company's capital costs, and thus the prices of its products to fall to such an extent that it would be unable to sell profitably in times of lower demand. They use the EU's reaction to the financial crisis to illustrate the extent of the influence that the demand side has on investment activity in contrast to monetary policy. At that time, the European crisis management, including the Troika, ECB, International Monetary Fund, and European Commission, imposed strict austerity measures on over-indebted member states. As a result, companies were confronted with falling demand for their goods and services and consequently also curbed their investment activity. Cuts in government spending logically lead to a decline in non-government revenues in the economy, say Massey and Ince. The ECB's ultra-loose monetary policy did nothing to change this. When supply chains were disrupted by the coronavirus crisis from 2020 and energy poverty caused by the war in Ukraine from 2022, the two supply shocks caused by a lack of public and private investment multiplied the productivity losses. As Massey writes in reference to the report with Dirk Ince on X, the European Commission's suspension of fiscal rules for member states and the ECB's PPP, Pandemic Emergency Purchase Program, bond purchase program contributed significantly to the EU returning to pre-crisis levels of economic strength faster than the US. However, by reintroducing its fiscal rules from 2024, it made a similar mistake as it did with its austerity measures in response to the 2007-2008 financial crisis. Can the financial sector solve Europe's productivity crisis? Like von der Leyen, Draghi is also a friend of financialization. In his report mentioned at the beginning, he underpins the positive aspects of financialized accumulation with a productivity gap that he highlights between the USA and the EU. Since the beginning of the 1990s, a gap has opened up between real GDP growth in the USA and the EU in favor of the North Americans. Draghi sees the reason for this in stronger productivity growth in the information and communication technology, ICT sector, including financial services. Without the ICT sector, productivity growth in the EU would be higher than the USA. In fact, labor productivity growth in the U.S. manufacturing sector was mostly negative in the 2010s, while it was mostly positive in the EU. But here too, Massey and Ince disagree. OECD data show that U.S. productivity in the information sector is not much stronger than in most other OECD countries and is even weaker than that of the South Koreans. It is therefore unlikely that the U.S. could catch up with the EU's productivity lead with the help of this sector alone. Moreover, according to Massey and Ince, the productivity of the banking and financial system is difficult to determine. As a reminder, this is also a sector that Draghi considers to be very important for the USA's productivity lead. However, Massey and Ince point out that the correlation coefficient between value added and employment share is negative for both banking and real estate services. This means that a higher share of value added correlates with a lower share of employment. The explanation that employment is declining due to rising labor productivity is unrealistic for the financial sector. Here, productivity is measured as transactions per minute, but this has not reduced the need for investment bankers. Their number increased in the USA in the 2000s. This led to an inefficient use of resources. Too much real estate was built. This led to the real estate crash in 2007. The fact that increases in productivity do not necessarily mean more real added value is also illustrated by Massey using another example on X. The GDP growth rate in the USA was higher than in the EU, especially in the 1990s. But growth was driven by an IT boom, the so-called dot-com bubble, and at the expense of investment in industry. In addition, the U.S. accession to the NAFTA Free Trade Agreement, 1994, and China's accession to the WTO, 2001, led to an increase in imports, with the result that almost 1 in 3 industrial jobs in the USA was lost. The statements by Massey and Ince show that not only von der Leyen's financialization plans to increase investment should be treated with caution, but also Draghi's claim that the U.S. productivity advantages would result from the ICT sector and financial services. What Ince and Massey do agree with Draghi on, however, is his call for more investment. This could be achieved by combining higher government spending at national level with more spending at EU level. The authors list 3 short-term options for this. Reactivation of the exit clause from the Stability and Growth Pact due to exceptional economic shocks. This could be justified by the ongoing war in Ukraine, uncertainty in the Middle East, and the need to adapt to climate change. A golden rule for investments. Certain government investments would be exempted from the deficit and debt rules for the public sector under the Stability and Growth Pact. Issuance of ECB bonds. These would replace national government bonds of the Euro member states and would be risk-free because the ECB could provide the member states with the necessary liquidity in euros at any time. These proposals are all based on an increase in public sector activity. The authors reject Draghi's call for a capital markets union instead. Anonymous investors who have little knowledge of fragmented European markets are susceptible to herd behavior and information asymmetries and therefore have a pro-cyclical effect on the economy. They argue. Draghi has addressed an elephant in the European room with his study. Damasi and Ince also seem to have found one. Although they explicitly call their paper the elephant in the room, they do not, however, specify who or what the elephant should be. It is quite possible that they are referring to orthodox economists' inadequate consideration of the demand side. Although supply and economies must be absorbed by sufficient demand, the premise that supply creates the corresponding demand on its own still applies too often. It is true that Draghi's call for extensive investment is relatively unorthodox among the orthodox. But von der Leyen's inaugural speech suggests that the state, especially the EU superstate, will not contribute much to the urgently needed investments. The Capital Markets Union will also come to nothing as long as it is only intended to improve access to liquidity, which is not lacking. The merit of Fabio Damasi and Dirk Ince is that they highlight the little-noticed role of the state in stimulating demand. Sometimes one elephant in the room is joined by another. It is impressive to see the brazenness with which the existing order of the international trade system is used in Germany to defend surpluses in foreign trade. Not a day goes by without various regulatory politicians and lobbyists trying to convince the German public that the new American trade policy is protectionism, purely arbitrary and completely irrational. Today, for example, Roland Koch writes in a statement from the Ludwig Erhard Foundation, "Our economic world is experiencing days of irrationality, days of despair, and hopefully swiftly a new start for reliable international cooperation. At the moment, U.S. President Donald Trump is indeed the most important authority in the global economy. As his customs policy is not subject to any predictable rules, everyone has to be constantly vigilant in order to at least make the economic impact, which they often could not foresee, manageable. EU President Ursula von der Leyen has succeeded at a price that is difficult to bear, in at least being able to hope for stability. We are all constantly surprised by developments because they have no comprehensible logic. One could try to understand a determined, possibly selfish pursuit of U.S. interests. But the assumption that this new form of trade war benefits the U.S. is so unfounded that it is always hard to believe that a president would do this to his country." Jameson Greer, U.S. Trade Representative, wrote about the American point of view once again on August 7th in the New York Times. "It is worth taking note of this view with an open mind," my translation. The Bretton Woods system ended in 1976, but its legacy lives on. Our current, nameless world order, dominated by the World Trade Organization and nominally designed to achieve economic efficiency and regulate the trade policies of its 166 member countries, is untenable and unsustainable. The United States has paid for this system with a loss of industrial jobs and economic security. Other countries have been unable to make necessary reforms, and the biggest winner has been China with its state-owned enterprises and five-year plans. Not surprisingly, over the past decade, there has been great bipartisan frustration, both internationally and in the U.S., with the failure of the system to align with the essential interests of sovereign nations. Now reform is on the horizon. Last week, President Trump and European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen struck a historic deal at his resort in Turnberry on the Scottish coast. A deal that is fair, balanced, and aligned with concrete national interests rather than vague aspirations of multilateral institutions. Through a combination of tariffs and agreements on access to foreign markets and investment, the United States has laid the foundation for a new global trade order. The previous system rejected tariffs as a legitimate public policy tool, which meant that the United States sacrificed tariff protection for key manufacturing and other sectors. Over the past 3 decades, the United States has dismantled barriers to our market to allow a massive influx of foreign goods, services, labor, and capital. At the same time, other countries kept their markets closed to our goods and used a range of measures such as subsidies, wage dumping, lax labor and environmental standards, regulatory distortions, and currency manipulation to artificially boost their exports to the United States. This approach turned the United States and a handful of other economies into consumers of last resort for countries pursuing beggar-thy-neighbor economic policies. Our trading partners were well versed in this game, and the elites on Wall Street and in Washington were only too happy to profit from global arbitrage by moving production abroad. The result? Most of the world's manufacturing shifted to countries like China, Vietnam, and Mexico, where companies could exploit vulnerable workers or benefit from large government subsidies while the United States ran up the absolute largest trade deficit in the history of the world. This led to extensive and well-documented losses of U.S. industrial capacity and jobs, as well as dependence on our adversaries in critical supply chains. We subordinated our country's economic and national security interests to a global consensus at the lowest level. This approach harmed American workers, their families, and communities by undermining a manufacturing sector that creates high-paying jobs, fosters innovation, and spurs investment throughout the economy. How should we assess this? End quote. The core of the economic argument, namely to oppose unfair trade practices, is absolutely valid. Germany, for example, has undeniably used unfair means to steal market share from other countries and generate surpluses. Many of these practices were possible because neither the World Trade Organization nor the EU Commission fulfilled their duty to prevent such practices. However, it is wrong to explicitly or implicitly blame the Bretton Woods system for today's distortions in the global trading system, as is often portrayed in the Trump administration and also by Greer. Bretton Woods was projected by its key architect, the Briton John Maynard Keynes, in such a way that no lasting external imbalances should be possible. It was only with the transition to a system of flexible, market-determined exchange rates in the early 1970s that major imbalances became possible, because speculation with currencies prevented precisely what Bretton Woods was characterized by: the balancing of inflation differences between countries through systematic currency appreciation and depreciation. This prevented major changes in the competitiveness of countries, not companies. An EU that has explicitly focused on competitiveness since the turn of the century is naturally one of the main opponents of the Trump administration. If this is not understood soon in Brussels and Berlin, much greater damage will be done. European mercantilism must be overcome as quickly as possible. The preeminent foreign policy question facing the West for at least the next several decades will be what to do about China's rise as a techno-economic, military, and foreign policy power. But as things stand, Western leaders cannot even agree on the premise of the matter. The prevailing view in much of Europe is that China is a rapidly developing country and a large market for exports that is being held to unfair standards by the West and the global institutions it dominates. Whereas the prevailing view in many U.S. policy circles is that China is a neo-Leninist nation seeking global hegemony through a predatory strategy of innovation mercantilism that focuses on advanced technologies and industries. European policymakers thus downplay the idea that China is a threat, focusing instead on the commercial advantages that stem from maintaining tight trade linkages. To the extent they even acknowledge there are problems with China's trade practices, they see the World Trade Organization as the avenue for resolving them, even though the WTO has failed at every juncture to rein in Chinese innovation mercantilism as it has gathered steam, industry by industry. Moreover, many Europeans are prone to seeing America as just as much a techno-economic challenger as China, and they are sympathetic to China's assertions that America is equally to blame for trade tensions. It is this point of view that explains French President Emmanuel Macron's recent statements about his visit to Beijing. He clearly views China as just another country seeking economic and geopolitical power, no different than the United States. He does not want Europe to be a vassal of either China or the United States. and he wants France to sell China more Airbus planes. Macron and other European leaders may not share the prevailing American view that China is run by an authoritarian, neo-Leninist party seeking global hegemony through predatory innovation mercantilist tactics. But they need to understand that it is because of this analysis of the situation, not a selfish desire to maintain U.S. hegemony, that the last two U.S. administrations have pushed back against China with measures such as tariffs, limits on Chinese investment in America, and selective export controls. Yet many European leaders seem skeptical. For example, European Central Bank President Christine Lagarde recently stated there is clearly a competition between these large economies, i.e., China and the US, and warned that trade should not be confrontational. This represented a puzzling lack of awareness or concern about Chinese economic policy, which for the last 2 decades has been nothing if not confrontational. As the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation and others have documented, China has lived up to almost none of the commitments it made to join the WTO in 2001. The massively distortionary subsidies it showered on its solar panel industry destroyed Europe's industry. It is doing the same in other key areas of European strength, including telecom equipment, machine tools, chemicals, high-speed rail, and increasingly aviation, autos, and biopharmaceuticals. European leaders are dreaming if they do not believe that Chinese techno-economic policies are focused on taking global market share from the EU. And they're being obtuse by refusing to accept that U.S. efforts to challenge China protect not just America, but also Europe. Indeed, the benefits are likely greater for the EU. As the German Mercatus Center has shown, predatory Chinese policies such as intellectual property theft, forced technology transfer, massive domestic and export subsidies, closed markets, and technology standards manipulation, among others, pose a higher risk to Europe than to the United States. To take one example, does anyone believe that European car makers will be selling many cars in China a decade from now? They certainly won't if China realizes its vision of supplanting them with its own auto industry, which is rapidly realizing, particularly in electric vehicles. Indeed, just as the United States led the fight against Soviet expansionism, not for selfish reason, but for altruistic ones, it is now trying to do the same vis-a-vis China. That is not to say the United States has done that job perfectly, but in the absence of a willing EU partner, it has done the best it could. U.S. policymakers realize they cannot let China become globally dominant in advanced technology industries, for that will make America, in the words of Macron, a vassal state. As part of the task of not letting China weaken U.S. advanced industries, there's a growing realization in political and policy circles that America needs an advanced industry strategy. The Information Technology and Innovation Foundation has termed this Hamiltonianism, after Alexander Hamilton, the first U.S. Treasury Secretary and the intellectual champion of the view that America could not remain a natural resource colony to Britain. In his 1791 report on manufactures, Hamilton wrote, "To produce the desirable changes as early as may be expedient may therefore require the incitement and patronage of government." That idea is the root of America's long tradition of national developmentalism. From its role in developing the technology for interchangeable parts in the 19th century to its more recent role in creating the Internet, the U.S. government has served as a catalyst in advanced sectors. With the end of the Cold War and the emergence in the 1980s of the neoliberal Washington consensus view that free trade and free markets are sacred, that proud and effective tradition was forgotten. But Hamiltonianism is making a slow comeback in response to China's techno-economic rise. At its core, contemporary Hamiltonianism is about ensuring that the United States stays ahead of China in advanced industries, especially dual-use industries that enable national power. It is about helping advanced enterprises in the United States gain global market share through legitimate innovation and industrial policies, while at the same time working to limit the damage China seeks to impose to all advanced economies through its economic predation. The recent CHIPS and Science Act, which included funding for semiconductor factories known as fabs, was a step in that process, as were the Trump and Biden administration's semiconductor export controls. However, to be clear, there is little support in U.S. policy circles for complete decoupling from China. The United States mostly wants what EU President von der Leyen recently spoke of as de-risking. However, for Hamiltonianism to become the dominant techno-economic doctrine, it needs to replace the neoliberal economic creed that holds the free market and free trade sacred. Under the neoliberal doctrine, the most important task for policy is to remove market distortions, because proponents believe free markets maximize economic welfare. This is why they denigrate industrial policy and believe there is little difference between computer chips and potato chips. Whereas Hamiltonian economics recognizes that innovation-based sectors are more strategically important and that they underperform in the absence of smart government policies. Similarly, neoliberals are so wedded to a pure ideal of free trade that they fail to recognize there is a problem when trade becomes a one-sided arrangement in which America is largely open and fair and China is closed and unfair, which hurts both the U.S. and global economies. By contrast, Hamiltonianism holds that failure to confront foreign economic predation leads to domestic firm deaths and global innovation lags. An array of avoidable and catastrophic failures in the U.S. economy have seriously challenged the neoliberal paradigm, including the hollowing out of America's manufacturing sector, the rise in income inequality, the 2009 financial crisis, and China's meteoric growth in a host of advanced industries. As such, while many continue to defend neoliberalism, they're likely on the losing end of history. With neoliberalism on its back feet, Hamiltonianism is one of three main contenders to replace it. One of the rival camps is Trumpian national protectionism, which holds that the United States does not need to be deeply engaged in global markets, and that protecting national markets is the way to go, either with tariffs or with Buy America provisions. This is a popular view in some quarters for political reasons, but for an array of practical ones, it cannot be a viable replacement for neoliberalism. The other contender is best understood as green equity industrial policy, which seeks to achieve an array of social policy goals through industrial policy. Most U.S. progressive organizations seek to move beyond the liberal post-New Deal consensus, in which the government helped advance social goals through taxes, spending, and regulation, and instead use industrial policies to force companies to implement their top two goals: reducing greenhouse gases and achieving social equity. As one progressive author notes, on the left, the visions of industrial policy today focus on how to transition to an egalitarian post-carbon social democracy. This is unfortunately where much of EU industrial policy is now, seeking to advance social goals rather than tech economic competition goals. Progressive industrial policy ignores both China and the very idea of industrial competitiveness. Many U.S. followers even support helping China because their allegiances lie with the global proletariat rather than their fellow Americans, per SC. And with their intensive focus on race and identity, many progressives attack anyone who advocates challenging China as racist. Like Trumpian national protectionists, progressives reject globalization, seeking a self-sufficient made-in-America ideal. It is this force, more than responding to the China challenge, that animates the Biden administration's Buy America efforts and similar restrictions in the Inflation Reduction Act, IRA. Against this backdrop, Hamiltonianism is gaining intellectual and political ground as China advances technologically and economically and gets bolder in buying off and intimidating other nations into aligning with it. Senators such as Tammy Baldwin, Democrat Wisconsin, Chris Coons, Democrat Delaware, John Cornyn, Republican Texas, Jerry Moran, Republican Kansas, Chuck Schumer, Democrat New York, Marco Rubio, Republican Florida, J.D. Vance, ROH, Todd Young, RIN, and Mark Warner, Democrat Virginia, to name a few, have all championed Hamiltonian-style legislation. Hamiltonianism is not just about using government to directly support advanced industry development. It also seeks to intervene internationally to advance U.S. techno-economic goals. Throughout the post-World War II era, the United States made an idealistic calculation in conducting foreign policy that sacrificing its short-term economic interests to shape the global geopolitical order in the West's image would accrue to everyone's advantage. Indeed, foreign techno-economic policy in the Cold War was simple. America had a foe, the Soviet Union. The United States wanted other countries to align with it against the Soviets, and so U.S. policy regularly sacrificed domestic economic development interests to advance U.S. foreign policy goals. One-sided trade deals, unilateral export controls, and robust aid to spur foreign economic development in nations like Japan, Korea, and Taiwan were used in pursuit of the overarching Cold War goal. The view was that the U.S. economy and technology system were so superior that policy could afford to trade away some of that advantage. When the Cold War ended, many policy thinkers envisioned a new end-of-history era where almost everyone, with the exception of a few rogue states, was to be America's friend because we stood for freedom, democracy, and prosperity. The inevitable path forward pointed to total global integration. Alas, Xi Jinping has other plans to dominate the world economically, technologically, diplomatically, and perhaps militarily. Now, every time the United States makes a sacrifice in the global marketplace, it cedes ground to China. As such, the neoliberal Washington consensus status quo can no longer work. As the Information Technology and Innovation Technology has showed in its Hamilton Index of Advanced Industry Performance, the United States now has less advanced industry output, e.g., semiconductors, machinery, aerospace, pharmaceuticals, as a share of GDP than the global average and more than 25% less than China. Leaving out Germany, the rest of the EU, 28, is even worse off. It is 33% less concentrated in advanced industries than the global average on a size-adjusted basis. The reality is that U.S. and European techno-economic power is severely diminished in the wake of U.S. free market lassitude and China's embrace of unfair advanced industry strategies. Now that power must be rebuilt and nurtured and no longer traded away for foreign policy goals. That will require embracing a Hamiltonian foreign policy that puts U.S. and allied economic interests first, including pressuring allies to choose between the United States and China, which the Biden administration has so far refused to do. As Secretary of State Blinken stated, this is not about forcing countries to choose. It's about giving them a choice. The problem is most countries and regions, especially Europe, will make the choice to have their cake and eat it too. Europe wants the best of both worlds: access to American markets and strategic and military aid, and access to Chinese investment in markets. European leaders' view is to let America pay any price and bear any burden in the fight for global freedom, as long as the EU gets to keep selling BMWs to China. They speak of the importance of a strong transatlantic alliance while at the same time unfairly deploying digital sovereignty protectionism against U.S. technology firms, restricting data flows, imposing discriminatory digital taxes, enacting a protectionist cybersecurity scheme, pursuing overly aggressive antitrust enforcement, and otherwise discriminating against U.S. technology products and services. And all the while, the EU continues to do anything it can to sell more cars, machinery, planes, and electrical equipment to China. During the Trump administration, officials from the EU and its member nations were happy to see the United States impose tariffs and other restrictions on China, knowing it would both slow China's mercantilist growth and bring retaliation against U.S. firms. A win-win. Rather than stepping up to support America in this task with measures of its own, the EU took advantage to further its own sales and investment in China. It was not because Airbus makes better planes that Boeing delivered just 8 airplanes to China in recent years while Airbus delivered more than 100 in what period? It was because of Chinese commercial retaliation against America. EU officials must have been jumping for joy. Just as Hamilton attacked Britain's unfair trade practices in the 18th century, today's Hamiltonians focus on limiting adversaries such as China from gaining competitive advantage in key industries, especially when they use of unfair and predatory trade and economic policies to do so. The Hamiltonian vision for foreign economic policy is simple. America should treat other nations based on whether they behave like friends, acquaintances, or foes. Friends would not only join with America in addressing the China techno-economic challenge, but also limit anti-U.S. economic and technology policies. Friends would cooperate on export controls, share commercial counterintelligence, work to limit and prosecute Chinese intellectual property theft, restrict imports of Chinese products made through unfair trade practices, limit Chinese research investment in domestic universities, stop most Chinese inward foreign direct investment, and cooperate to counter China's Belt and Road initiatives. Friends would share responsibilities but also benefit from opportunities in return. Friends would not be subject to Buy America requirements. Friends could participate in joint technology projects and other partnerships. Friends could cooperate on joint supply chain initiatives. Friends would be on a list of countries approved for inward investment. Friends would cooperate on technical standards issues. Friends would participate in new, robust 21st century trade agreements, including open cross-border data flows. Friends would be countries in which the U.S. government can make industrial investments to produce certain products that support national defense requirements, including microelectronics and medical supplies. Friends would also be part of a new system of collective resilience, which would threaten to jointly cut off China's access to vital goods whenever Beijing acts against any single member. Acquaintances would be those nations that refuse to choose sides while maintaining mercantilist policies toward the United States. They would receive less than full access to the U.S. market and limited cooperation on techno-economic issues. They would be subject to mirror taxes if they levy discriminatory digital services taxes on U.S. firms. Companies in these countries would have limited ability to transfer U.S. citizens' data into their territories if they refuse to allow their citizens' data to be transferred to the United States. Finally, foes would be nations whose interests are antithetical to the free world's interests. They would be subject to limited trade and investment, limited cooperation, and countermeasures to limit their ability to grow by carrying out unfair practices. This kind of framework is critical for the simple reason that to counter China's global advance, America can neither go it alone nor trade away U.S. economic and trade interests for other foreign policy goals. Given the rising geopolitical and techno-economic challenges from China, a number of nations would likely choose friendship. Japan, for example. The Japanese government recently agreed to ban certain semiconductor sales to China to support the Biden administration's efforts. The government is also seeking to move Japanese companies' production out of China. It is boosting its defense budgets, and it has made commitments to side with Taiwan in the case of an invasion from mainland China. Commonwealth countries, including Canada, the United Kingdom, and Australia, also likely would want to be friends. But it's not clear what the EU would choose. While some EU member nations, especially those in Eastern Europe, would likely choose friendship, it's likely many others, especially France and Germany, and the EU as a bloc, would be unwilling to do what it takes to be a friend, given that some, like Macron, believe they are American vassals. Because so many EU leaders still hold onto the first view of China, that it is simply a developing nation and a victim of U.S. aggression. They are loath to give up the short-term economic benefits of staying on Xi Jinping's good side. EU Council President Charles Michel reflected this when he stated in response to Macron's visit to China. On the issue of the relationship with the United States, it's clear that there can be nuances and sensitivities around the table of the European Council. Some European leaders wouldn't say things the same way that Emmanuel Macron did. I think quite a few really think like Emmanuel Macron. Perhaps after another decade of experiencing China's techno-industrial predation, the EU might come around to the U.S. view, but by then it will likely be too late for many member states' economies. What China is and it wants is the most important global policy question of our era, more important even than climate change, which will ultimately be solved by further technological breakthroughs that make clean energy as affordable as fossil fuels. As long as Europe sees China as a normal country, not as a neo-Leninist aspiring global hegemon, it's unlikely it will join American efforts to keep China from becoming the world's apex superpower. Europe can only hope that it can create a stronger and more self-sufficient economy in the face of Chinese techno-economic predation, and pray that the CCP either implodes or becomes a benevolent hegemon. But all three are unlikely outcomes absent a change in view. Absent a massive political upheaval in the United States, Hamiltonian efforts to win the techno-economic battle with China are likely to continue and increase in intensity. Europe can either join in this important cause or can try to become its own superpower, as Macron wants. Good luck with that. After the United States saved Europe from a Nazi takeover and then for 45 years shielded it from Soviet invasion, most European policymakers embraced Atlantic Europe, a view that Europe needed to be closely tied to the United States, both economically and militarily. But with the fall of the Soviet Empire, Europe turned inward to construct a single integrated European market EC92. Now that this project has largely been completed, Europe is shifting to Fortress Europe, seeing China and the United States as almost equivalent techno-economic challengers, focusing on technological sovereignty vis-a-vis America, while taking a get as much as you can approach to trade with China. Many European leaders still want the protection of Pax America, but the leeway to attack U.S. firms and the U.S. economy, and the freedom to engage freely with the Chinese economy, including by selling products to China that the United States forbids with export controls. It is time for the United States to say enough is enough. In doing so, the goal should not be to separate from Europe, but rather to create a more level playing field that enables a new era of deeper integration, grounded ideally in a comprehensive and bold EU-US trade agreement. Europe is making a strategic mistake of untold magnitude by abandoning Atlantic Europe in favor of Fortress Europe. It would be akin, to use a Lord of the Rings analogy, to Rohan deciding that both Gondor and Sauron posed equal risks. China is just too powerful, and its technological, military, and economic progress are so rapid that if the EU continues to try to go it alone, China will surely succeed in its divide and conquer strategy. However, it would be a mistake for U.S. policymakers to be so desperate for transatlantic concord that they continue to downplay the EU's techno-economic aggression. It's time for America to start pushing back by making it clear Europe does not get a free ride in attacking U.S. techno-economic interests while making its own side deals with China. U.S. policymakers must do more than complain diplomatically to French, German, and other EU policymakers in various dialogues and fora about their efforts to replace goods and services from U.S. tech firms. If the United States tried something similar in a sector in which European firms held most of the market, such as luxury vehicles, the righteous outcry from European defenders of the rules-based global trading system would be immediate and damning. Yet, because European leaders drape their efforts in European values and associated privacy, competition, and cybersecurity interests, U.S. policymakers and the media give them a free pass. Even when European leaders repeatedly and consistently say the quiet part out loud, that they want to replace U.S. firms and products, U.S. policymakers still pretend that European partners are acting in good faith, or that they don't really mean it. Encouraging Europe to change its approach to U.S. tech has geostrategic implications. Europe is in a different place strategically in relation to China than it was just 5 years ago. Europe and many other Western nations, such as Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and South Korea, would like nothing more than to see the Chinese mercantilist cap belled, but they all lack the courage to do it. So, Europe is happy to leave that task to the United States, describing the conflict wrongly as the U.S.-China trade war, so they can avoid punitive retaliation, while at the same time enabling their companies to take U.S. market share in China. Indeed, that is exactly what has happened. While the United States has been taking the heat in fighting back against Chinese innovation mercantilism, a task that benefits Europe perhaps even more than it does America, the EU has moved in and captured what was formerly U.S. market share there. That is not how an ally behaves. Europe is still largely anchored to policies of the past and thinking that it can appease China and maintain its market access, and China won't eventually target its advanced industries for eradication. European officials often talk in private about concerns they share with the United States about China, but the time for subtlety and inaction has long since passed, because the United States no longer has the ability on its own to potentially force change in China. That time is long past. It will take a concerted and coordinated effort for the United States, Europe, Japan, Australia, Canada, South Korea, and other allies to have any chance of enacting collective defenses against predatory Chinese economic practices. A united front can impose costs on China that together would have the potential to limit its gains in advanced industry market share. So, the EU needs to join with the United States to limit China's techno-economic aggression, and at the same time cease its own aggression against the United States. But the United States has not established any real policy to make the EU think there could be tangible consequences for its discriminatory policies. U.S. officials' approach has been to complain to their European counterparts, not go to the mattresses, largely because the U.S.-European policy community argues that America needs the EU for broader strategic interests, especially resisting Russian aggression. While President Trump and other past U.S. presidents, such as Kennedy, have focused on the threat of withdrawing troops, Europe has always known that was a paper tiger, and so it has proceeded apace. It's time for the United States to respond more strategically. Just as the EU seeks to add new instruments to its strategic autonomy toolbox to ensure it can defend itself against countries that abuse its openness, from a carbon border adjustment mechanism, CBAM, to mirror Clausesto anti-coercion instruments, so too must the United States. Congress and the next administration should review U.S. trade defense tools to reflect the rise of European protectionism and digital sovereignty. If left unchecked, Europe's approach will provide a model for other countries and regions to emulate, which ultimately will lead to the fragmentation of the global digital economy into national and regional walled gardens. The first part of this report provides current and historical context and examples of EU tech sovereignty and tech protectionism to highlight that, while not new, it presents a strategic threat to U.S. trade and tech leadership, especially in light of Chinese techno-economic aggression. The second part details the large EU trade surplus with America. The third part details the EU's array of unfair, innovation mercantilist practices and policies. The final part puts forth ideas for new, reciprocal tools the United States can develop and use against European firms, technologies, and trade to demand a level playing field. The transatlantic relationship appeared to get back on track in 2021, with the United States and Europe having put aside disputes over the Airbus-Boeing file, although Airbus had benefited vastly more from its subsidies than Boeing did from its, as well as the steel and aluminum dispute. They also launched the EU-US Trade and Technology Council to engage in dialogue on a range of tech issues. However, these papered over even deeper trade conflicts, including in digital industries. There is a clear synergy between the European Commission's industrial and trade policy strategies, but just not in the open and fair way that Europe so often likes to portray itself in the context of defending the rules-based international trading system. U.S. policymakers need to realize that this is neither incidental nor accidental. In fact, it's central to their approach. The United States needs to treat it as such, similar to how it treats Chinese protectionism. European policymakers commonly portray digital and tech sovereignty as a strong yet nebulous concept, usually referring to the assertion of state control over data, data flows, and digital technologies, coupled with the replacement of U.S. technology firms with European ones. That it helps them take back control and sovereignty from mainly U.S. technology firms is not a bug, but rather a central feature. The European Center for International Political Economy has summarized a mix of 4 factors behind the emergence of technological sovereignty: culture, control, competitiveness, and cybersecurity. In reality, there's only one: protectionism. While the vague and broad notion about state control over data and digital technologies is evident in the various policy issues and debates, it is clear what this means in practice: targeting U.S. firms and products to ultimately replace them with European ones. European leaders, such as former German Chancellor Merkel and French President Macron, explicitly have called for both digital protectionism and data sovereignty in talking about digital and technological sovereignty. It means different things to different officials. For example, the mere fact that data from companies such as Volkswagen were stored on Microsoft and Amazon servers was enough for Germany's former economy minister Peter Altmaier to state that in this we are losing part of our sovereignty. The French Minister for Economic Affairs went so far as to call U.S. big tech companies adversaries of the state. For the European Commission, European control largely means that Europe's policymakers retain the capacity to cater to European firms and advance Europe's economic interests globally. Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission president, signaled the EU's protectionist objectives. We must have mastery and ownership of key technologies in Europe. Sabine Weyand, the Commission's Director General for Trade, has echoed that point, arguing there has been a shift in the international order from a rules-based system to a power-based system. And the EU has every interest in opposing that shift because rules-bound international trade protects everyone from arbitrary discrimination. To that end, Weyand says Europe needs to proceed with what she calls a dual integration of everything the EU does economically at the international level on one hand, and on the other hand, internal EU policies such as industrial policy, internal market policy, competition, or even research policy. In sum, Wyan says we must accept this duality, whereby we continue to defend a multilateral order based on rules, but also accept that it is essential that the EU do so from a stronger position. While European officials defend their conceptualization of open strategic autonomy as not being about autarky and self-sufficiency at every turn when it comes to tech policy, that's exactly what it is. Even if Ms. Wyan doesn't interpret it this way, other European officials and political leaders are enacting digital regulations that ultimately reflect this. Even the recent Draghi report on EU competitiveness reflects this view, even if it often uses code words to mask the EU's intentions. But with regard to cloud computing, the intent is open. For reasons of European sovereignty, the EU should ensure that it has a competitive domestic industry that can meet the demand for sovereign cloud solutions. European efforts to undermine American tech leadership and firms are not new, but simply the latest in a long history. Likewise, so is American concern about how to respond. Three quotes from the 1960s reflect this historical point. He who has technological superiority is master. U.S. dominance risks creating a science gap to the benefit of the United States, a loss of balance from which our economic freedom of action could suffer. He who has technological superiority is master. Certainly, it would be absurd to systematically oppose oneself to the introduction into a country of a foreign firm, which brings in a superior technology and thus contributes to economic progress. Nevertheless, we do not see how a nation could maintain its political independence if such penetration becomes generalized. P. Cognard, Française Délégation Générale à la Recherche Scientifique et Technique, 1964. Tu assist Europes process baia technological subsidii, might serve to perpetuate bad European practice. Moreover, a substantial part of our favorable trade balance depends on our tech superiority, and we should not give it away for nothing. Telegram from a Department of State to Secretary of State Rusk, 1966. Political concern in Europe with the technological gap remains high. They recognize that all of the major factors are ones they must deal with themselves, and there is no longer talk of a Marshall Plan for technology. But a deep uneasiness remains. We encountered evidence of rising nationalism everywhere, most clearly in Germany, where the view was expressed, for example, that a major modern state must have an independent capacity to produce computers which are the key to the new society of the electronic age. The fear within Europe of U.S. domination in key European industries is a source of political strain. Europeans are anxious to benefit the maximum extent from U.S. technological advances while avoiding possibility of American tech domination. This combination of aims has resulted in an ambivalent approach. On the one hand, they are considering essentially protective measures. On the other, they would like the broadest access to U.S. gov-financed R&D. 20. Memorandum from the President's Special Assistant for Science and Technology, Hornig, to President Johnson, 1967. While Europe targeted U.S. firms and trade during the Cold War, the strategic context was clearly different, including the overarching emphasis on Atlanticism. Europe depended almost completely on the United States to keep it from being invaded by the Soviets. Today, while Russia is a security issue for Europe, it's not an existential-level threat. Nor is it something that, if Europe had bothered to build up its own military, Europe could not today handle on its own. Europe also benefited technologically and economically from U.S. military protection. As the new Draghi report on EU competitiveness notes, the safety of the U.S. security umbrella freed up defense budgets to spend on other priorities. In a world of stable geopolitics, we had no reason to be concerned about rising dependencies on countries we expected to remain our friends. It was not the United States that said no to friendship, it was Europe. And there is no word of thanks here. No acknowledgement that the fact that the EU could and did scrimp on defense spending enabled it to spend on commercial technology development at the cost of the United States. Also, during the Cold War, Europe was not a serious threat to U.S. technological leadership, so it didn't pose a strategic risk. However, now it is different, and with U.S. and European advanced industries under threat from China, the United States cannot afford two-front techno-economic aggression. The Cold War is over, and Europe's discriminatory tech policies can and do have a sizable impact on U.S. tech firms and their hard-fought leadership positions. Listening to European policymakers and politicians target U.S. tech firms and products, one might be excused for thinking that the EU must be running massive trade deficits with the United States that are hollowing out its economy. The reality is completely the opposite. In 2023, the EU ran a trade surplus of $208.7 billion with the United States. As seen in Figure 2, the EU runs significant trade surpluses with the United States in pharmaceuticals and medical devices, motor vehicles and parts, electrical goods, telecommunication goods, chemicals, and instruments. Of the 27 EU nations, all but 7, Malta, Luxembourg, Croatia, Lithuania, Belgium, Spain, and the Netherlands, runs trade surpluses in goods with the United States. And the country whose officials complain the loudest of U.S. digital dominance, Germany, runs the largest trade surplus. In one of the few areas where the U.S. runs a surplus, digital services, the EU is trying to undermine it. Analyzing the International Monetary Fund's, IMF's, telecommunications, computer, and information services category in the Balance of Payments Guide is a readily comparable measure of digital services across countries. The telecommunications, computer, and information services trade category captures the trade of services included in the broadcast or transmission of sound, images, data, or other information by electronic means, hardware and software, and database services and web search portals, among other services. It shows that transatlantic trade is large and growing, while the U.S. trade surplus in these services is shrinking. U.S. digital services exports to the EU rose from $12.8 billion to $17.9 billion between 2013 and 2023, while EU digital services exports to the United States rose from $7.7 billion to $16.2 billion. The EU is also outperforming the United States in relative performance in the 10 Hamilton industries: pharmaceuticals, electrical equipment, machinery and equipment, motor vehicle equipment, other transport equipment, computers, electronic and optical products, information technology and information services, chemicals, basic metals, and fabricated metals. Relative performance is measured using a location quotient, LQ, which is a measure of industrial specialization relative to the rest of the world. An LQ of 1 means a country's share of global output in an industry is on par with the size of the global average. Since 1998, the EU's LQ has exceeded the United States rather steadily. As of 2020, the LQ of the EU was 0.98 and the United States LQ was 0.87, meaning that while the EU has been able to produce and grow in these strategically important sectors at a pace almost equal to the global average, the United States has fallen behind. There are a host of ways Europe protects its markets and attacks U.S. competitors, all of which contribute to the large bilateral trade imbalance. Before detailing EU protections and aggression against U.S. firms and workers, it's worth looking at 2 issues: Brexit and digital sovereignty. When the United Kingdom was deciding whether to leave the European Union, both Brexit supporters and opponents agreed that leaving the EU would likely mean a decline in EU market opportunities. But what few pointed out was that this was ipso facto an indictment of closed EU markets. If EU markets were truly open, as EU officials like to tout, Brexit should not have affected the United Kingdom's trade with the EU. But they are not, and that is why between 2014 and 2020, Brexit went into effect in 2020. The United Kingdom's trade deficit with the EU was around 26% of its exports. By 2023, that had increased to 30%. Indeed, one study finds that Brexit reduced trade by 20% between the EU and Britain. So much for free trade, Europe. The second issue is the notion of EU digital sovereignty, the claim that leading EU officials make that they should not be dependent on the United States for digital technologies. Let's be clear what this means. Imagine if Europe said it wanted steel sovereignty. That would mean no steel imports and no foreign steel makers in Europe. How about wine sovereignty? The same. Thus, the campaign for digital sovereignty is protectionist, pure, and simple. And we see a host of policies and initiatives that Europe is engaging in to achieve its digital protectionism. Perhaps it is time or American luxury car sovereignty. Europe engages in at least 3 main types of unfair trade activities related to the United States: discriminatory purchasing, revenue extraction and reduced payments, and discriminatory regulations. In traditional global trade theory, everyone involved, sellers and buyers, is a utility maximizer. If a seller can buy a foreign product that is as good as a domestic one for a lower price, they do. But like so much of neoclassical economics, the reality on the ground is very different from the idealized reality. Europeans generally are not utility maximizers when it comes to trade. National loyalty plays a role, much more than in the United States, and that accrues to their advantage when it comes to trade flows and industry strength. One factor that limits U.S. exports to the EU is the nationalistic consumption patterns wherein EU consumers exhibit more loyalty to their own country's products. For good or ill, U.S. consumers are largely utility maximizers, having almost no loyalty to domestic companies when it comes to making a purchase. Whatever is cheaper is preferred. Europe is different. Many consumers want to buy national. We see this in the long-standing difficulties in getting to a European single market, especially in services. Policymakers blame the failure on the inability to finish creating streamlined EU-wide regulations, even after more than 30 years of trying. But even if Europe could achieve this regulatory harmonization, Europe would still see services localization because so many EU consumers are nationalistic buyers. Many consumers often won't even buy from European firms outside their country, much less from firms outside Europe. Take automobiles, for example. In Germany, German cars account for around 50% of car sales, while French cars account for 5.4%. In France, it's the opposite. French vehicles account for 34% of sales and German 21%. This has nothing to do with transport costs of the autos from the factory and everything to do with consumer nationalism. We see the same pattern in commercial aircraft, where Airbus is unfairly favored in Europe, not only with a history of massive subsidies, but with nationalistic purchasing by EU airline companies. If market forces were the only thing at play, one would expect to see the same share of Airbus purchases in Europe as in other nations. Yet, a sample of 3 large European airlines, Lufthansa, SAS, and Air France, shows that their fleets are 70% Airbus and 13% Boeing. The top 3 airlines in America are 39% Airbus and 61% Boeing. Whereas in neutral countries for large airlines, Air India, ANA, China Southern, and Singapore have 43% Airbus and 53% Boeing. Something other than product value is at work here. European airlines buy Airbus out of EU loyalty, not out of commercial interests, and that not only violates free trade as it is conceived by European policymakers, but it also boosts the EU trade surplus, especially with the United States. Consumers and government-influenced or controlled companies are not the only ones engaged in nationalist buying. So is government. Data from the U.S. Government Accountability Office suggests that the EU uses government procurement to discriminate against U.S. firms. Its report estimates that the EU governments awarded $300 million to U.S. firms in government procurement in 2015, while the United States awarded $2.8 billion in procurement awards to EU firms, a level more than 9 times higher. A key component of unfair EU trade practices vis-a-vis the United States is a combination of attempts to unfairly extract revenue from American companies and policies to limit the revenue American companies receive from Europe. We see this in many areas. Many EU nations have proffered a fanciful notion, which goes against long-standing corporate tax treaties, that foreign, usually U.S., digital companies should pay corporate taxes to the EU nations rather than to their home country. As the Tax Foundation has written, Austria, Denmark, France, Hungary, Italy, Poland, Portugal, Spain, Switzerland, Turkey, and the United Kingdom have implemented a DST. Belgium and the Czech Republic have published proposals to enact a DST, and Latvia, Norway, Slovakia, and Slovenia have either officially announced or shown intentions to implement such a tax. Digital service taxes are bad policy that provide a thinly disguised effort to target U.S. tech firms. Proponents of DSTs try to justify this tax grab by claiming that users are creating value and therefore that value should be taxed where users reside. Otherwise, under international corporate tax agreements, foreign nations would not be allowed to tax other countries' corporate profits. In fact, users do not create value. Companies do. Users consume, digital companies produce. Furthermore, taxing profits based on where users reside would violate long-standing international agreements by taxing income more than once and imposing an ad valorem tax that primarily targets imports. DSTs obviously discriminate against a narrow set of highly digital industries, mainly search engines, social media platforms, and online marketplaces. Precisely because they fall mainly on U.S. companies, DSTs also likely violate existing trade agreements, as they act as a prohibited de facto tariff. More specifically, the high revenue thresholds that subject a firm to a DST and the exclusion of certain revenues widely earned by European firms create de facto discrimination against U.S. digital firms, in violation of the European Union's national treatment commitment under the General Agreement on Trade and Services. Meanwhile, the European Commission also has cracked down on individual member states attempting to attract international investment by offering competitive tax policies. For example, the Commission ruled in 2016 that Ireland wasn't taxing Apple enough and ordered Ireland to collect more than $14 billion. Irish officials defended their tax practices and Apple appealed. But in September 2024, the European Court of Justice ruled in the Commission's favor, ordering Apple to pay Ireland €13 billion, $14.3 billion, in back taxes. At times, it seems as if the Commission is seeking to fund itself by levying exorbitant fines on big American tech companies. For example, in 2017, the European Commission imposed a record-high $2.3 billion fine on Google for, allegedly, manipulating its search results to favor its own shopping comparison service to the detriment of its rivals. In contrast, the U.S. Federal Trade Commission found no search bias and concluded instead that Google's behavior benefited consumers. In 2018, the European Commission doubled down on Google with an even higher fine of $5 billion in another competition law case involving Google's operating system Android, followed by a 2019 fine of $1.7 billion in a case involving Google's AdSense online advertising program. In 2024, the Commission levied its third-largest antitrust fine ever, $1.9 billion on Apple. In 2023, the Commission levied a $418 million fine on chipmaker Intel. While the United States and EU try to support domestic semiconductor production, including from Intel, the Commission makes it worse. Qualcomm was hit by a $258 million fine. While China is trying to build up its tech champions and tear down American, it turns out that it has an ally in Europe. This does not mean that all fines are unfair, but it's not likely that these fines would be anywhere near as severe if these were EU national champions. The General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, is also another important moneymaker for Europe. As of January 27, 2022, of the 900 fines that EU data protection authorities have issued under GDPR, 7 of the top 10 were against U.S. firms, including an $877 million fine against Amazon and $255 million fine against WhatsApp. According to the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, IDIF estimates between 2020 and 2023, EU governments imposed at least $3.1 billion in fines on U.S. companies under GDPR, equivalent to $29 per American household. Because the EU depends heavily on U.S. digital platforms, including content providers, it is seeking yet another way to extract dollars unfairly. In this case, a so-called fair share policy for internet traffic that imposes extra fees on U.S. content companies to subsidize European internet service providers, ISPs. This unfair share policy would mandate that content providers, such as Netflix and YouTube, pay fees to European ISPs in return for use of the latter's bandwidth. No other region does this, for the simple reason that broadband customers pay their own ISP to download bits. Rather than content providers sending data unprompted, it is the ISP's own customer that is paying to have the data delivered to them. Given this, the fair route would be for ISPs worried about too much data use to charge heavy data users more. But going after American content providers is much easier. Free money for the EU ISPs and less competition for their own content channels. In addition to wanting to extract revenue from U.S. companies, the EU is also seeking to limit revenue going to U.S. companies. We see this in at least two areas: pharmaceuticals and computer hardware and software. Through their draconian price controls, European governments refuse to pay their fair share for U.S.-developed drugs. They free ride off American drug companies' hard work and massive expenditures to develop new drugs. For example, in 2018, if the Netherlands had paid U.S. prices for drugs, it would have paid 122% more, while Germany would have paid 87% more and France 84% more. These price controls mean a higher U.S. trade deficit with Europe because, by definition, EU consumers are getting imports at a mandatory discount. For example, if Spain, Italy, France, and Germany alone had paid their fair share, the U.S. trade deficit with the EU would have declined in 2018 by approximately $75 billion. It also means less biopharmaceutical innovation because drug company revenue and research and development, R&D, is less than it would be otherwise. The EU pays U.S. companies for hardware and software because these companies have invested billions of dollars to develop intellectual property and high-quality products. The EU doesn't want to have to pay, so it has long focused on developing open-source systems. And let's be clear, this is about excluding U.S. firms. The EU official open-source working group has stated that the working group advocates that this roadmap of activities is supported via coordinated European-level actions to avoid fragmentation and ensure that Europe retains technological sovereignty in key sectors. It went on to note, an open-source ecosystem needs to be stimulated that can act as an alternative to licensing IPs from non-EU third parties. This is a euphemism for American companies. In other words, we don't want to pay for software imports anymore. Europe specializes in regulations that discriminate against foreign goods and services, especially American. The EU Digital Markets Act, DMA, should have been called the U.S. Tech Firms Act. The European Parliament rapporteur for the DMA, Andreas Schwab, suggested that the DMA should unquestionably target only the 5 biggest U.S. firms: Google, Amazon, Apple, Facebook, and Microsoft. He stated that the DMA's revenue threshold, to be designated as a so-called gatekeeper, should be 10 billion euros and a market value at least 100 billion. He went on to say, let's focus on the biggest problems, on the biggest bottlenecks. So let's go down the line, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and maybe 6 with China's Alibaba. But let's not start with number 7 to include a European gatekeeper to please Biden. Basically, the DMA and Digital Services Act, DSA, are designed to cover almost exclusively U.S. firms and not their European or Chinese competitors that offer similar services. A leaked draft of the proposed EU DSA is quite clear on the intent. Asymmetric rules will ensure that smaller emerging competitors are boosted, helping competitiveness, innovation, and investment in digital services. Essentially, the EU shifting the focus of competition intervention from efficiency to market structure objectives would push competition law in a new direction toward a structural big is bad doctrine. Basically, a company's size, rather than its conduct, would determine whether the new set of ex-ante-competition rules apply to it. This approach ignores the dynamic competition that gatekeepers bring to the market, the consumer welfare generated by the existing framework, and the innovation and investment incentives necessary to generate future technological breakthroughs. The DMA creates the false dichotomy that a digital market can be separated from a non-digital market, rather than seeing it as simply one of many ways for firms to reach consumers, as a business model and distribution mechanism. Europe and its courts has laid down differing double standards when scrutinizing U.S. surveillance practices as compared with what it allows for EU member states. Despite this, the United States consistently engages in good faith efforts to work with European counterparts to create new frameworks and special safeguards and mechanisms for redress for European personal data that don't even exist for U.S. citizens. Edward Snowden's revelations about the U.S. National Security Agency's intelligence collection programs have led to successive Court of Justice of the European Union, CJU, cases that have restricted and cut off data flows to the United States. CJU judgments, Schrems I and Schrems II, have invalidated 2 transatlantic data transfer arrangements, the Safe Harbor Framework and the Privacy Shield Framework. The United States has definitively discontinued a controversial telecommunications metadata collection program exposed by Snowden. It has also enacted other limitations and controls over U.S. surveillance practices. Ultimately, even a national security agency's revised metadata program hasn't been reauthorized. It lapsed in 2020, and there are no signs that the Biden administration will try to seek legislative reapproval. The United States is developing new oversight and redress mechanisms as part of negotiations with Europe on a successor agreement to Privacy Shield. If there is an open question whether data transfers from the EU to the United States comply with new European laws, there is a clear answer on China and other authoritarian regimes. Their safeguards bear no essential equivalence to EU standards of privacy. Never mind the fact the European Data Protection Board, EDPB, recently conducted a detailed study into government access to data in China, India, and Russia. There are no calls to cut off data to these countries. At the same time, European governments have received a mostly green light from the CJU to continue their own bulk metadata programs for national security purposes. The CJU opened the door a crack for continued bulk metadata retention for national security purposes in Europe in the recent La Quadrature du Net and others judgment. European policymakers have long deflected calls of hypocrisy, as Article 4.2 of the Treaty of European Union states that national security remains the sole responsibility of each member state. The CJU decided that if a member state determines that a serious threat to national security exists, it may order service providers to collect and retain bulk metadata, so long as the program is not systemic in nature. Soon after, France's highest administrative court, the Conseil d'État, ruled that such a threat existed and that the French government could continue to utilize metadata previously retained for national security purposes. Meanwhile, Germany has decided to end excessive data retention. At the same time, the EDPB investigated and criticized Europol, the European Union Agency for Law Enforcement Cooperation, after reports showed it had collected a huge amount of personal and sensitive data. Yet, EU member states and the European Parliament agreed on a new Europol mandate that essentially overruled EDPS's call for them to delete this data and allowed Europol to continue its data collection practices with new safeguards. In 2020, the EU created the GAIX project and the European Cloud Initiative, in essence, to replace U.S. cloud providers. As usual, Europe tried to drape its efforts in moral values and seemingly upstanding public policy objectives. Europe framed GAIX as an open, transparent, and secure digital ecosystem, where data and services can be made available, collated, and shared in an environment of trust. It would create European cloud services and a marketplace to exchange data on conditions that apply European values to data protection, cybersecurity, and data processing. Yet, from its inception, its true objective to replace U.S. providers has been clear. In 2021, Amazon, Microsoft, and Google made up 69% of the EU cloud market. Europe's biggest cloud player, Deutsche Telekom, accounted for only 2%. This isn't the first time France, Germany, and others have tried to forcibly replace U.S. cloud providers and others, such as Search, via the French-supported Quant search engine, which failed and was bailed out by Huawei in 2021. GAIX is a French-German initiative to help build tech sovereignty, to encourage firms to store their data with local alternatives to AWS and other U.S. cloud firms. GAIX is an organization, not an actual cloud provider, that aims to connect different cloud providers and users so data can move freely between them, while abiding by GDPR's restrictions. Essentially, Europe hopes that it'll help local firms, such as SAP or Deutsche Telekom, to become larger and more competitive. In 2019, France Finance Minister Bruno Le Maire stated that France had enlisted tech companies Dassault Systems and OVH to break the dominance of U.S. companies in cloud computing. 79 indicative of how GAIX fits into their plans. In September 2021, France's digital minister told French GAIX participants to go faster because they held in their hands no more no less than a part of France's digital sovereignty. In October 2021, French President Emmanuel Macron lamented that Europe was very late with its sovereign cloud plans. Certain EU nations have passed laws requiring cloud computing services to be physically located in their country. For example, in 2022, France enacted updated sovereignty requirements as part of a new cybersecurity certification and labeling program known as SEC Number Cloud. SEC Number Cloud's sovereignty requirements disadvantage and effectively preclude foreign cloud firms from providing services to government agencies as well as to 600-plus firms that operate vital and essential services. The latest SEC Number Cloud guidance, version 3.2, March 2022, retains broad data localization requirements for all data, both personal and non-personal, and foreign ownership and board limits, which would effectively force foreign firms to set up a local joint venture to be certified under SEC Number Cloud as trusted and thus able to manage European data and digital services. A prior post for the Cross-Border Data Forum also analyzed this proposal and how it breached EU trade law commitments under the World Trade Organization, WTO, Government Procurement Agreement, GPA. France is leading efforts to embed SEC Number Cloud's sovereignty requirements in the European Union Agency for Cybersecurity's ENIS's Cybersecurity Cloud Services Scheme, which is under development. The latest version of SEC Number Cloud explicitly requires suppliers of cloud computing services to store and process their customers' data within the EU. This effectively constitutes a ban or a zero quota in WTO terminology on the cross-border supply of these services. Europe's selective application of surveillance scrutiny also applies to privacy enforcement. With the death of Privacy Shield, transatlantic data flows face death by 1,000 cuts. Privacy activists NOIB have filed complaints in all 30 EU and European Economic Area member states against 101 European companies that share data with Google and Facebook. They plan to file hundreds more. In January 2022, Austria's Data Protection Authority found that the use of Google Analytics was a breach of GDPR. This is the first ruling in this line of complaints, but it's not going to be the last. In another separate case, a Munich court found that a website owner's use of Google fonts violated the plaintiff's general right of personality and right of informational self-determination of their IP address under Section 823 of the German Civil Code. Like the Austrian decision, the only personal data submitted to Google was the user's IP address. Google's use of standard contractual clauses could not overcome the risk of U.S. government surveillance. No matter how unlikely or unrealistic the scenario that the U.S. government would seek a European user's IP address based on their specific interaction with an EU-based website's analytics tooling or font library. It's privacy fundamentalism, given that it essentially means that any IP address shared, for any reason, in any context, with any U.S. entity subject to U.S. surveillance laws, likely also exposes personal data. In February 2022, France's DPA responded to another NOIB complaint and ordered websites to not use Google Analytics. Meanwhile, none of NIOB's complaints were against Chinese, Russian, or other firms using standard contractual clauses to transfer EU personal data. In 2016, Max Schrems stated that firms could use standard contract clauses to transfer EU personal data to China, but not for the United States. Chinese firms could somehow provide assurances that EU personal data could be protected from surveillance in China, where there is no true rule of law and Chinese laws allow extensive state surveillance. DPA investigations into Chinese firms, including Mobike, BikeShare, BGI Group, Genetics, and TikTok, social media, remain limited. Technical standards are key enablers of trade and commerce. The norm is for them to be set by industry-led voluntary bodies. However, the EU has long resisted this process because, like China, it wants to manipulate standards setting to favor its own products and firms. Now in its bid for digital sovereignty, the EU wants to ignore international standards-setting processes and related trade law for new technologies such as artificial intelligence, AI. The EU's theory is that by setting its own standards rather than following standards developed by international organizations, it can promote European values in areas such as data protection, cybersecurity, and ethics. The European Council on Foreign Relations has stated, if the EU does not set its own standards, it will be forced to adopt standards made by others, who may not share its values. Governance of the Internet, including technical governance, is becoming increasingly bifurcated. The danger is that countries will be forced to choose between adopting the standards of a U.S. Internet or Chinese Internet, and to thereby give up access to the other market. A section written for the Commission is even more clear. While skepticism remains regarding the readiness and willingness of member states to harness their strengths collectively towards European technology sovereignty, there is no alternative to do so. But the logic and process reek of protectionism. By rejecting global technical standards in favor of its own alternatives, the EU is trying to give its firms an advantage over foreign competitors. For example, the EU's common specifications sound obscure and non-threatening, but they are potentially powerful tools for protectionism. A common specification is defined as a document, other than a standard, containing technical solutions providing a means to comply with certain requirements and obligations established under laws/regulations. This requirement features in recent legislation and regulations for medical devices, cybersecurity, the AI Act, machinery products, and the Data Act. For example, the AI Act specifically mentions it in the context of AI risk management and record keeping. In the Data Act, it's mentioned in relation to building interoperability of common European data spaces. When the Commission creates common specifications for these technologies, it will be mandatory for firms to abide by them to sell into the EU market. The EU can use common specifications to override or ignore international standards whenever and however it sees fit. For example, it can do so when no harmonized European standard exists or if one needs revisions. It can also do so if one of the three key European standards organizations denies or delays the EU's request to develop standards, or if the EU simply deems the relevant international standard unsatisfactory or does not address European legislative requirements or the EU's standardization request. The European Commission, at any point over the last few years, could have clarified that common specifications are a tool of last resort and that deference would be given to international standards. Yet it hasn't. The EU could easily engineer a situation to use common specifications, such as setting an unrealistically short deadline for standards or saying they are too slow. For example, the AI Act sets an unworkable 2-year deadline for 2 European standards bodies to develop a broad and complex set of local standards. Point 96. Never mind that this task ignores the years of work a joint committee of the International Standards Organization, ISO, and the International Electrotechnical Commission, IEC, has already done since 2019 on AI standards. In another case, the Commission released the standardization request for the Accessibility Act to the European Telecommunications Standards Institute, ETSI, at the last possible legal moment. It is virtually assured that ETSI will miss the compressed legislative timelines, even though it has already spent years working on relevant standards. The EU can do this, as common specifications don't have the critical safeguards of standards developed at international organizations: no transparency, inclusiveness, due process, or appeals mechanism. In contrast, the EU can handpick participants, who may not be technology experts but simply Commission officials, to work behind closed doors, away from scrutiny, to develop common specifications that are mandatory in the EU market. WTO members anticipated that countries could try to impose local technical specifications as trade barriers, exactly as the EU is now doing. That's why WTO members have committed to using open, transparent, and voluntary standards. The EU and its member states are WTO members and are now violating their commitment. Just as China is doing now, Europe has a history of blocking U.S. mergers that pose a competitive challenge to its own firms. Perhaps the most famous of these cases is the blockage of the GE Honeywell merger in 2001. The EU also blocked a proposed merger with Sun and Oracle, even though U.S. authorities would have allowed it. It's impossible to say with hindsight what would have happened had the EU not blocked these mergers. But Sun went out of business, and it's hard to imagine how General Electric could be any weaker today than it already is. Perhaps if these mergers would have been allowed, Oracle, and especially GE, would be stronger today. The EU also sought to block the merger of Boeing and McDonnell Douglas, which the EU opposed because it did not want stronger competition to its continental champion Airbus. As Dorothy Robin, who helped negotiate the deal in the Clinton White House, noted, the highest drama occurred in 1997, when the EU's chief competition authority, a Belgian socialist named Karl van Meijert, publicly threatened to block the Boeing-McDonnell Douglas merger because of the potential harm to Airbus. Unlike the United States, with its consumer-focused competition policy, the EU is allowed to consider the impact of a merger on domestic competitors. A potential trade war was averted when DoD sent a decorated Air Force general to Brussels to explain why the merger was important to the U.S. military. The United States needs to use existing tools better and develop new ones to better target EU protectionism. It needs to be able to go to the mattresses and come back with more than a feather duster or toy Nerf gun. The United States does not need to use all its tools at once, but it should start enacting some short-term measures and putting in place the legal and administrative reforms to create new tools for the future, in case they're needed. In other words, EU policymakers need to know there will be real negative consequences for their continued actions. At the heart of the United States' approach to European trade should be a focus on the core principles of the multilateral trading system at the WTO: transparency, due process, national treatment, and non-discrimination. If European laws and regulations don't live up to these core principles that the EU itself advocates for in supporting the WTO and the global trading system, then it should trigger a ratcheted and targeted response by U.S. policymakers. It's time that the next administration hold the EU up to its own standards, especially in terms of its treatment of U.S. firms. Doing more than complaining to European officials will likely elicit retaliatory action from Europe. But Europe can't continue to have it both ways, benefiting from cooperation, military assistance, and open trade with the United States while still targeting U.S. firms and trade. The federal government needs to use both offensive and defensive trade policy measures. The next Congress should update a main trade defense tool, the Trade Act of 1974, for the digital era by amending it so that it can respond to the type of barriers, digital, that are central to modern trade. Section 301's traditional use of tariffs makes it easy to apply to 20th century trading goods, but it needs to be amended to create new legal and administrative mechanisms and tools to target service providers. Although Section 301 mentions fees and restrictions on services, it should be amended to detail the mechanism in terms of responsible agency and process, in terms of the action, such as licensing, certification, or legal judgment, whereby the administration imposes specific retaliatory measures on a foreign service provider. For example, it should be amended to create a reciprocal joint venture requirement wherein French, German, and Chinese tech and cloud firms will be forced to set up local joint ventures with equivalent ownership and control restrictions that U.S. firms have had to set up in their respective countries. The next administration should use Section 301 to initiate an investigation of the DMA, as it is among the most clearly egregious examples of European policymakers targeting U.S. firms. There is a clear case to be made that the DMA would meet the standard for action under Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974. However, an investigation could be broader and include other EU digital sovereignty initiatives, such as discriminatory cybersecurity regulations and exclusively European cloud initiatives. The Biden administration could enact retaliation via tariffs on imported goods, the traditional use of Section 301, taxes or restrictions on EU digital service companies doing business in the United States, a new use of Section 301, and restrictions on other EU service providers, such as accounting firms, air carriers, media companies, automotive companies, aerospace companies, and others. The Department of Commerce could interpret new rules regarding the use of information and communications technology, ICT, goods and services by foreign adversaries to apply to transactions with EU firms that use ICT goods and services with those same adversaries. The Rule 86 FR 4909 on securing the information and communications technology and services supply chain provide a framework for commerce to unwind ICT services transactions with foreign parties that 1. Involve ICT's information and communications technology and services designed, developed, manufactured, or supplied by persons owned by, controlled by, or subject to the jurisdiction or direction of a foreign adversary, defined to include China, Russia, Iran, Cuba, Venezuela, and North Korea, and 2. Poses an undue or unacceptable risk. The rule allows commerce to review transactions involving a wide range of ICT products and services, including data, hosting, and computing of sensitive personal data. Europe is well within the potential scope of application, given the Commerce Department's focus on ensuring that the rule can be used as effectively as possible. Commerce has ruled out categorical exemptions of specific industries or geographic locations, although the Secretary of Commerce may consider this possibility in the future. Wholesale exemptions of industries and geographic locations would not serve the rule's intended purpose of securing the ICTS supply chain because such exemptions would contradict the Commerce Department's evaluation method for ICTS transactions. Such exemptions would apply to foreign adversaries' whole classes of ICTS transactions outside the scope of evaluation under this rule. Europe's and others' use of digital service taxes to single out American tech firms for blatantly discriminatory punishment needs a clear response. The Office of the United States Trade Representative, USTR, has already released a detailed Section 301 report on the issue, including the threat of retaliation. As Gary Huffbauer at the Peterson Institute for International Economics suggests, the United States should amend the Internal Revenue Code to enact a tax on large foreign firms that extracts funds in mirror image fashion to the discriminatory digital tax on U.S. firms. Section 891 of the Internal Revenue Code, enacted in 1934, provides the legal authority for the president to retaliate against foreign discriminatory or extraterritorial taxes. It allows the president to enact taxes and to ratchet them up on foreign citizens and firms. It has never been used. Congress could adapt it for the modern era in mandating a tax on the global revenues of large firms based in France, Italy, and other DST countries when those firms sell goods or services in the U.S. market. The tax could be legislated to expire upon either of two events: agreed international rules that subject tech giants to taxation in countries reached by their platforms, or repeal of an individual country's own DST tax. The DMA specifically targets not only U.S. firms, but also core components that make up their competitive and innovation goods and services. The DMA includes a provision requiring gatekeepers to disclose certain search engine data, rankings, search data, click and view data, to third-party providers of online search engines upon request and on fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory FRAND terms. It's essentially state-directed forced trade secret disclosure, vis-a-vis China's forced technology transfers. Congress could create a cause of action in U.S. courts for U.S. firms to obtain financial damages from EU companies that use this provision to obtain their trade secrets and other commercially sensitive information. This would essentially act as a blocking statute to counteract discriminatory EU digital laws and regulations. While the U.S. firms that would potentially use this are small, given the EU is targeting just 5 firms, it would send a clear signal that there are consequences for unfair and unjustified state intervention into a firm's trade secrets and competitive position. Thierry Breton, the EU Commissioner for Internal Market, has argued that European data should be stored and processed in Europe because they belong in Europe. There is nothing protectionist about this. 106 no, actually there is. As such, if the United States and the EU cannot work out an easy-to-administer process by which data can flow seamlessly across the Atlantic, the United States should adopt a similar approach to Europe's, limiting the transfer of U.S. person data to European companies in Europe. The U.S. President has the legal authority to withdraw the Trade Agreements Act waiver for the EU with respect to the Buy American Act program, or for particular categories of EU products/services or suppliers, such as certain technologies or digital services. For example, the President can add or remove in-product categories that are subject to trade agreements in lieu of Buy American Act preferences in Department of Defense (DoD) acquisitions. Similarly, the United States can adjust discretionary preferences under the Foreign Military Sales Program. Ultimately, the end result would be similar to how the United States purposely excludes adversaries, such as China and Russia, from ICT supply chains and procurement, and how U.S. firms and products are excluded from China's and Russia's procurement markets. U.S. policymakers could exclude EU firms from U.S. funds in order to boost U.S. production of medical goods and services. The United States should not be inadvertently bolstering the EU's plan for strategic autonomy in the area of medicine to reduce strategic dependencies and foster production and investment in Europe. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services 100-day supply chain review calls for boosting U.S. production through a blended mix of targeted investments and financial incentives. Also, to combat the EU's significant trade surplus with respect to pharmaceuticals and incentivize domestic production, the United States could consider imposing tariffs or other import restrictions on EU pharmaceuticals. The Biden administration should move ahead with proposed plans by DoD and Congress to amend the Defense Production Act to expand the list of countries in which the U.S. government can make industrial investments to produce certain products that support national defense requirements, such as microelectronics and medical supplies. Currently, only the United States and Canada are on the list, but DoD wants to include the United Kingdom and Australia. Until the EU makes clear its commitment to once again embrace Atlanticism, as opposed to fortressing Europe, the administration should ensure that the EU and its member states are not included. The United States should create its own capability to identify and respond to other countries that fail to provide comparable or reasonable safeguards, frameworks, and agreements around government access to data, and that otherwise misuse concerns over foreign government access to data to selectively enact restrictions that target U.S. firms. This would support ongoing discussions at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, on the issue of government access to data. Whether it's national security or Europol-motivated access to data, EU member states, leaders, and parliamentarians realize that there is a real and legitimate trade-off with privacy at home. It's time the United States makes sure it recognizes that this also exists internationally, and that selective application of concerns will entail costs. Doing so would ensure foreign countries, especially European ones, could not hypocritically call for changes in the United States that they themselves don't provide at home and only selectively scrutinize certain countries' practices. The United States, especially after the 2015 passage of the USA Freedom Act, which was the biggest pro-privacy change to U.S. intelligence law since the original enactment of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act in 1978, and other post-Snowden reforms, has been rightfully described by Oxford expert Ian Brown as the baseline for foreign intelligence standards. Independent analyses, including by the EU's own Fundamental Rights Agency, have documented great variations in rigor among privacy safeguards against surveillance conducted by EU member states under domestic legal authorities. The United States should create an interagency body, hosted by Commerce Department, that identifies whether EU member states and other trading partners have similar or equivalent safeguards and oversight for government access to data, as the United States does. The Biden administration's Executive Order, EO, on protecting Americans' sensitive data from foreign adversaries is relevant, but it mainly targets China's and Russia's ability to access U.S. data. But the basis for this EO and its many processes and outcomes are applicable to Europe's selective and hypocritical application of concerns over government access to data. President Biden's Executive Order number 14034 on protecting Americans' sensitive data from foreign adversaries provides for cabinet-level assessments and future recommendations to protect against risks from foreign adversaries' access to U.S. persons' sensitive data and involvement in software application supply and development, and also the continuing evaluation of transactions involving connected software applications that threaten U.S. national security. It is, in part, based on the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, 50 U.S.C. 1701 etc. AIPA, the ongoing emergency that President Trump previously declared in Executive Order 13873, securing the information and communications technology and services supply chain, arises from a variety of factors, including the continuing effort of foreign adversaries to steal or otherwise obtain United States persons' data. Biden's EO states that the continuing effort by foreign adversaries constitutes an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security, foreign policy, and economy of the United States. To address this threat, the United States must act to protect against the risks associated with connected software applications that are designed, developed, manufactured, or supplied by persons owned or controlled by, or subject to the jurisdiction or direction of, a foreign adversary. The Biden administration should do this via a subsequent, complementary EO that tasks the Secretary of Commerce, In consultation with the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Attorney General, USDR, Secretary of Health and Human Services, Secretary of Homeland Security, Director of National Intelligence, and heads of other agencies as the Secretary of Commerce deems appropriate, to work together on the issue. Similar to USDR's approach to investigating and responding to digital service taxes, the United States should use this investigation into what oversight and safeguards other countries use with regard to privacy and surveillance, and how these compare with the United States, and identify countries that misuse concerns about privacy, cybersecurity, and surveillance to enact restrictions that target U.S. tech firms and products, while not applying similar scrutiny and restrictions on local and other foreign firms and countries. In the event the United States finds that countries are unfairly targeting U.S. firms, it could draw up tariffs and other regulatory restrictions to enact against these countries and their own tech firms, but suspend them pending the reasonable conclusion of a US-EU Cloud Act agreement, negotiations over government access to data at the G7 and OECD, or both. Signing up to and abiding by a Cloud Act agreement and potential OECD framework on government access to data would become the basis for ensuring continued market access to the U.S. digital economy, given it would represent an international best practice and genuine, good faith effort on behalf of governments on what is a global issue, on an issue that is often used to disguise digital protectionism. At first glance, what is remarkable about the list of EU actions against the United States and its tech firms is that it bears a striking resemblance to what China is doing. Both want to weaken the U.S. tech economy so that they can boost their own strength. Both want to displace U.S. tech companies through open source. Both put severe price controls on drugs. Both use antitrust to weaken U.S. firms. Both use government procurement to favor their own firms. Both impose significant fines and other penalties on U.S. firms through antitrust. Both pressure their firms to buy local. Both limit data flows. Both push for open-source technologies to become free of American imports. Both use government funding to prop up competitors of U.S. firms. Both pressure U.S. firms to set up data centers there. To be sure, China is much worse in the applications of these tools, but the EU is engaged in similar behavior against the United States. And both are seeking strategic independence from the United States. The Draghi report states, these dependencies are often two-way. For example, China relies on the EU to absorb its industrial overcapacity, but other major economies like the US are actively trying to disentangle themselves. If the EU does not act, we risk being vulnerable to coercion. Yes, the United States is trying to disentangle itself from China, an authoritarian state bent on global techno-economic domination. If Europe were astute, it would be doing the same. But the United States is not trying to disentangle itself from the EU. Moreover, the idea that the EU is vulnerable to U.S. coercion is both nonsensical and offensive. Given that the United States has protected Europe with its military, America has had plenty of opportunity to coerce the EU and never has. But wait, isn't the United States protectionist? EU officials and experts love to trot out the canard that the United States is protectionist. I have a one-word answer for this question: no. But I will expand it to a six-word answer: $904 billion U.S. current account deficit. To say that the United States is protectionist when it runs the world's largest trade deficit is, frankly, laughable. The EU? It currently runs an account surplus with the rest of the world. Case closed. But what about Buy America and Buy American provisions that favor U.S.-made goods in federal government procurement? Again, a $904 billion current account deficit with the world and a $125 billion goods and services trade deficit with EU. But even if this were not the case, as previously cited, the U.S. government already procures 9 times more from the EU than vice versa. So the EU can start complaining about Buy America when that ratio is down to 1. And finally, the big kahuna, the IRA and CHIPS Act subsidies for investing in America in clean energy and semiconductor facilities. First, these kinds of subsidies are par for the course now, being rampant in most Asian nations. Like it or not, the only way to assure domestic production in these kinds of critical industries, especially to compete against the Chinese juggernaut, is to provide investment subsidies. Rather than complain, the EU should wake up and get in the game. And of course, EU firms are eligible for these subsidies. Oh, and let's not ignore that massive launch aid given to Airbus, without which the company would not have survived. This all feeds into the popular narrative that the United States turns its back on the world. According to this tale, America was the epitome of global openness, and with Trump it became a villain of protectionism, with Europe left to hold aloft the beacon of free trade. It is a reassuring narrative to Europeans, but it is false. First, if this is true, why is it the U.S. goods and services trade deficit with the European Union as a share of gross domestic product, GDP, actually increased from 0.43% in 2016 0.45% in 2023? How exactly is that protectionist? Again, if and when the EU runs a trade deficit with America, we should talk. Otherwise, stop the posturing. After criticizing China, Mario Draghi, author of the new report on EU industrial policy, had the audacity to put the United States in the same camp as China, stating the U.S., for its part, is using large-scale industrial policy to attract high-value domestic manufacturing capacity within its borders, including that of European firms, while using protectionism to shut out competitors and deploying its geopolitical power to reorient and secure supply chains. Mr. Draghi, please explain and give examples of how the untied states has shut out European competitors from the U.S. market. Moreover, is it using its geopolitical power to reorient supply chains out of China? Are you really saying that you oppose this? That you trust China and believe that it is playing by the rules and has no designs on becoming the new global hegemon? Europe is right to focus more on competitiveness, and hopefully the forthcoming Draghi report will include useful recommendations that get implemented. But that strategy should not be one focused on Fortress Europe against both China and the United States, for not only would that be extremely short-sighted for Europe, but it would also be turning its back on the West and democracy. It is time for Europe to realize that China is the core threat to the West, and that it should be supporting, not attacking, U.S. efforts to limit and protect against the damage from Chinese innovation mercantilism. The goal should be Western competitiveness, not European. Some argue that we must do whatever we can to not alienate the EU so it can help address the China challenge. But that misses the point. As long as the EU views the United States and China is in the same camp as competitors that limit EU technological sovereignty, any efforts by the United States will fail. The EU will not join the fight, preferring to take advantage of the commercial conflict between the United States and China, and it will not roll back its protectionist and mercantilist actions toward the United States. The United States needs to be clear that the EU must roll these actions back and join with the United States in a new, democratic, free trade bloc. And if it fails to do so, the United States will respond with countervailing economic force. But if Europe does decide to join with America, then both sides should do whatever they can to strengthen the alliance. This should start with an EU-US trade agreement, which eliminates all tariffs on products traded between the two nations and eliminates virtually all non-tariff barriers. This would require EU leadership ignoring the anti-American civil society groups in Europe and both their often nonsensical and anti-scientific concerns, such as chlorinated chicken, GMO crops, proposed bans on silicones, and their outright lies about investor-state dispute settlements. The fact that EU interest groups tanked the prior deal is one more bit of evidence of how closed EU markets really are, as well as how unserious the EU is in addressing the critical issues of today's global economy. Any new, comprehensive trade agreement between the United States and the EU should lay out a cooperative formula for export controls to China, import restrictions on China, commercial counterintelligence sharing vis-a-vis China, and finally, deep advanced technology cooperation, especially in critical industries under threat by China. Since the 1960s, Europe has viewed U.S. IT leadership with alarm. As French economic journalist Jean-Jacques Servan-Schreiber wrote in his 1968 bestseller, The American Challenge, one by one, U.S. corporations capture those sectors of the economy most technologically advanced, most adaptable to change, and with the highest growth rates. Like today, Europeans characterize the challenge in dire terms: a seizure of power, invasion, domination, counterattack, and industrial helotry. But unlike for today, Servan-Schreiber didn't call for an attack on U.S. firms. He called for Europe to get its house in order. build a single market, fund advanced technology R&D, and expand university enrollment, particularly in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. He eschewed any talk of punishing or rejecting U.S. investment. In fact, he wrote, "Nothing would be more absurd than to treat the American investor as guilty and to respond by some form of repression." While the Draghi report does not go as far as Servan Schreiber did in eschewing anti-American policy, it is far in the right direction. But to date, EU officials have done little to remedy the EU's problematic and protectionist policies, in part because they know that the transatlantic blob, the network of think tanks, influencers, companies, and government officials committed to a harmonious cross-Atlantic relationship, will veto any tough action. It's time to end that, at least in the United States. The next administration should make it clear that unless the EU effectively addresses a significant share of these trade barriers and anti-US policies, the US government will take firm action. And the faster that the EU can recognize that the challenger is not America, but rather China, the sooner we can get on with forging a much more productive relationship. However, should the EU continue to choose to go it alone, seeing the United States and China each as threats, it will lose. Its only hope is a strong alliance with the United States, and that will not happen as long as the EU continues to discriminate against U.S. companies. Finally, if the United States makes it clear that it will no longer accept this kind of discriminatory EU behavior, the EU hopefully will realize that it has to modify its approach. Then, and only then, can we reestablish a strong Atlanticism for the 21st century, one based on much deeper cooperation, including in advanced technology, in order to not succumb to the Chinese advanced technology challenge. The idea that the EU can be competitive in advanced industries on its own and against both China and the United States is ludicrous. China, not the United States, is the threat to Europe. This is equivalent to Europe saying in the height of the Cold War that it wanted to be unaligned and compete militarily and economically with both the Soviet Union and the United States. It has been a century since the U.S. economy surpassed the combined size of France, Germany, and the UK, largely because America was powered by European immigration and mass production factories. Today, China's economy exceeds the United States in PPP terms and is expected to exceed it in dollar-denominated terms by 2030. China already leads in advanced industry production with its 2020 output in 10 industries 17% higher than America's and 25% higher than the EU's. The horse is already out of the barn when it comes to China overtaking Europe and America economically and technologically. The key difference is that when America overtook Europe, the two were not adversaries. Today, China is, with Xi Jinping referring to the need for China to win the battle for core technologies. In contrast, too many US and EU officials still cling to the fiction that it's possible to negotiate with China to achieve fair competition and even cooperation. While neither the US nor the EU can hope to change China nor outpace its advanced industry growth, they can and should not lose the battle for either advanced industries, e.g., aerospace, high-speed rail, biopharmaceuticals, semiconductors, machinery, software, etc., and/or emerging ones, e.g., AI, quantum computing, synthetic biology. Collectively, these are a principal source of geoeconomic power, and Chinese victory in these sectors would turn the transatlantic partners, the US, UK, and European nations, into techno-economic vassal states, dependent on China for key inputs. China has already won steel, shipbuilding, solar panels, and it is gaining high-speed rail, telecom equipment, EVs, and machine tools. Not losing this battle is not about figuring out what policies and programs to adopt. There are many reports from think tanks and others laying out such an agenda. Policymakers could easily craft an actionable agenda by inviting experts to a 2 or 3 day brainstorming retreat. The real problem is that policymakers on both sides of the Atlantic do not take the China challenge seriously enough to do so. As such, the most important task for the transatlantic policy community is to recognize the true nature of the threat and adopt a new conceptual framework. Albert Einstein once stated that we shall require a substantially new manner of thinking if mankind is to survive. Today, if the transatlantic community is to survive, elites will need a new manner of thinking. The two most important components are to 1. Recognize that the EU and US have far more in common than they don't, and that they are collectively in a great power techno-economic competition with China that is more akin to war than a game of football guided by rules and norms. And two, understand that not losing this techno-economic war is the most important non-military task. It is about not losing rather than winning, because it's not likely the transatlantic community can gain significant global market share in these industries over China. But it can and should avoid seeing its key sectors slowly decimated by Chinese predatory practices like intellectual property theft, massive subsidies, and closed Chinese markets. The United States, especially Congress, is further in understanding point one, in part because since World War II, the U.S. has shouldered the global defense of freedom. As such, it's easier for American policymakers to understand the true nature of adversaries. Many EU policymakers naively cling to the belief that China is a normal nation competing for economic competitiveness, just like democratic nations do, and that existing rules and institutions, like the World Trade Organization, can effectively address economic conflicts. Thankfully, as the reality of Chinese innovation mercantilism become clearer, it appears that EU officials are shedding some of their blinders and utopian globalist beliefs. But when EU President Ursula von der Leyen states that global integration and open economies have been a force for good for our businesses, our competitiveness, and our European economy, and that will not change in the future, it's clear that the EU has still not caught up to reality. Is it too much to ask for EU policymakers to not lag 5 years behind the United States in understanding the true nature of the China challenge? On issue 2, the United States is also ahead, but not by as much. While Trump, Republicans, and many centrist Democrats understand the importance of not losing the techno-economic war to China, many traditional Republicans are worried more about military superiority over China and about maintaining freedom and a small government at home. Industrial policy remains anathema to them. For most Democrats, including the Biden administration, competing with China takes a backseat to what they see as the two most important challenges: climate change and racial equity, with the latter requiring significant income redistribution and limits on corporations. Indeed, when President Biden was running for president, he made it very clear that he rejected the notion that China was an economic threat to the United States. In 2019, he stated, "China is going to eat our lunch? Come on, man. I mean, they're not bad folks. But guess what? They're not competition for us." The administration seems to still believe this, as it has done little to confront China's innovation mercantilism other than its export controls on semiconductors, which it justifies in military terms. If the view is that China does not present a competitive challenge to America, the door is open for hundreds of billions of dollars for domestic spending. Building mass transit, insulating houses of low-income Americans, subsidizing costly clean energy, eliminating college debt, and expanding healthcare. Acknowledging the true nature of the China threat would require way more techno-economic guns and way less domestic policy butter. Unfortunately, the dominant views in the EU are even worse, with an almost exclusive focus on clean energy. Winning the solar panel race will not cut it. And when it comes to winning in advanced industries, the EU seems to think winning means designing the most restrictive technology regulations, while at the same time punishing U.S. technology companies. Sadly, it does not appear that this will change anytime soon. Both EU and US officials tell themselves that they can have their green cake and eat it too, that by leading the clean energy transition, they can outcompete China. But that is not the case. There are far too many sectors critical to national power that will not be supported by green industrial policy, including aerospace, semiconductors, and advanced computing, machine tools, and biopharmaceuticals. And in the United States, the libertarian right and the equalitarian left shows no signs of retreat, with the former wanting more military spending and less spending on everything else, including competing with China, and the latter wanting to use regulation and competition policy to tear down large corporations, while ensuring that tax and spending advances social policy goals, not competitiveness. Nonetheless, let's suppose the ideal happens and conceptual frameworks change that in turn enable real policy innovation. In the United States, this would mean that virtually all federal government programs and regulations that affect the economy are restructured and reinvigorated around the goal of not losing to China. To be sure, this is easier said than done. The old DNA of federal agencies is deeply entrenched, and powerful special interests resist real change. Still, one can hope. Let me provide two examples of how change might happen. First, the U.S. science system. The current system dates to after World War II, when the academic science community convinced Washington that personal investigator-directed scientific research focused on basic science was the key. Policymakers are told that any changes to this will have dire consequences, not just on the conduct of science, but on U.S. technological leadership. But that system, like so many other U.S. systems, is no longer purpose-fit for a world where China is the pacing competitor. In the old model, researchers pick the areas of research. In the new model, the state prioritizes key areas where China is a threat. In the old model, the federal government provided the lion's share of funding. In the new world, industry funding, incentivized by the federal government, needs to play a key role. In the old world, publications were the key goal. In the new world, transferring knowledge to the domestic private sector is the key goal. In the old world, science was seen as global, so cooperation with Chinese scientists and university students is an unalloyed good. In the new world, science cooperation with China is seen as fraught with risks. To be sure, Congress is aware of some of these challenges, but unwillingness to see China as an existential threat means that efforts at change have been incremental at best. A case in point is the 2022 CHIPS and Science Act. The science part created an initiative to fund research in 10 key areas, but because of political pressures and limitations, the program was placed in the National Science Foundation, NSF, rather than an agency more focused on commercial development. And the original industry areas were broadened to include domestic social challenges, like clean water. When it came to funding, the original legislative funding proposals were cut in half, while funding for the traditional NSF science programs doubled. Finally, as NSF implements this program, it's likely that the working with industry component will be paid lip service at best. If Congress took the China challenge truly seriously, it would have done something quite different and far bolder. Congress would have created a National Advanced Industry and Technology Agency dedicated to working closely with industry. It would have appropriated far more money and required that most of the money be spent in university-industry research partnerships to support industries and technologies threatened by China. We see that same incrementalism regarding the U.S. Export-Import Bank, EXIM, an agency established in the 1930s to provide exporters with patient capital. Congress realized that through its massively funded export finance and development banks, China was bribing the way for its industries to capture contracts and influence around the world. In response, Congress created within EXIM the China and Transformational Export Program, which requires EXIM to invest 25% of its lending authority in deals that compete with China in 10 designated technologies. Certainly, a useful step. But if Congress took the China challenge truly seriously, it would have picked technologies critical to America's future. Water treatment is not one. Provided significantly more lending authority to the bank and allowed a loss rate of at least 10%, instead of mandating that the bank earn at least a 2% rate of return. It also would have changed the core mission of the bank from job creation to winning the global battle for advanced industries with China. This would include lowering the domestic content requirements to enable the bank to fund a greater number of projects that contain less American labor, but that still challenge Chinese expansion. In other words, U.S. efforts have been incremental. If China is truly seen as the existential threat to the West, we'd see a new approach to not just science and export financing, but to many areas of economic policy. We would see a trade policy that prioritizes market opening for advanced industries, rather than supporting all industries, including agriculture or financial services, equally, and revised and improved trade protection tools to limit market access of unfairly supported Chinese companies. We would see a much more generous R&D tax credit and a new investment tax credit. We would see a regulatory system with two tracks, one for domestic serving industries and a more flexible one for sectors competing globally, especially with China. Congress would transform the Small Business Administration into the new, high-growth Business Administration. We would see a workforce development system focused more on generating skills needed for advanced industries and less on subsidizing English literature degrees. The EU is no different. There is no broad-based commitment to outcompete China, even if EU officials naively believe that its green strategy will do the trick. And there is an unwillingness to invest. For example, the new German-China strategy states, "We will strive to implement this strategy at no additional cost to the overall federal budget." Good luck with that, because without significantly increased financial support for German innovation and advanced industry companies, Germany will lose. But even if the EU and the US develop a broad-based consensus on the real nature of the China challenge, domestic action alone will not be enough. We need to join forces, and that has to start with real transatlantic cooperation. Unfortunately, Europe thinks it is competing against both the United States and China, and that it needs strategic independence from both. This is music to Beijing's ears. During the Obama administration, I co-chaired its U.S.-China Innovation Experts Group. At a lunch in Beijing with a high-level Chinese government official, I asked how the Chinese government would handle increased resistance to Chinese unfair economic and trade policies. The official said they were not worried about individual countries or even the G20. What really worried them is the G2, a strong alliance between the EU and US. It was the threat of the G2 ganging up on China that kept him awake at night. Today, he must be sleeping very soundly, for the trade tensions between the EU and the United States are quite high, and the EU refuses to name United States a key ally and China a key adversary. To listen to many EU officials, one could easily get the message that the United States is the EU's key technology adversary. The reality is that the United States cannot adequately prevent Chinese global technological dominance without full and unstinting cooperation with the EU. Because if China wins in Europe, its companies will be too powerful for American companies to compete with. But this cooperation will not happen until policymakers accept the two key realities discussed above. While some in the EU seem to be moving in the direction of recognizing that China is not a normal country when it comes to trade and globalization, overall, the EU has a long way to go, especially as Germany keeps resisting EU efforts to get tougher with China, and as EU officials still maintain the fiction that it is possible to reform the WTO in ways that can stop China's mercantilism. They even believe that China should play a part commensurate with its economic weight to help achieve this objective. It boggles the mind to believe that China will allow changes to the WTO that would constrain its widespread manipulation of the global trading system. Likewise, when the Commission states, to achieve a maximum benefit from the trade and investment relationship between the EU and China, solutions to long-lasting concerns will have to be found. Ensuring reciprocity, achieving a level playing field, and addressing asymmetries in the relationship is a matter of priority. That ship has sailed. The only reciprocity, level playing field, and addressed asymmetries possible is from the transatlantic side. China will not roll their mercantilism back. EU officials appear to be living in a fantasy world where if only they can have enough meetings and constructive dialogue, China will start playing fair. Germany continues this delusion in its strategy on China, which states, at the same time, China is an essential partner as regards global challenges. No, it is not. The CCP's cover-up made the pandemic worse, and there is no need to partner with China on climate change. China will cut emissions when CCP officials see it as in their interest to do so, and bribing them to do so lets China win. At the end of the day, the EU needs to decide whose side it's on. The EU wants it both ways, to be friendly with China and the United States, and to avoid getting involved with the U.S. trade war, which most in Europe wrongly see as U.S. protectionism. The reality is that America did not start the trade war China did in the 2000s, and it is not being fought solely for the United States. It's being fought on behalf of all allied nations. It's time the EU stopped free-riding on U.S. efforts, though doing so appears to be one of Europe's few comparative advantages. Relatedly, the EU needs to significantly dial down trade tensions with the United States. This is not the place to litigate who is more at fault for deteriorating trade relations, although I would argue that most of the blame lies on the eastern side of the Atlantic. When German Chancellor Olaf Scholz states that European sovereignty means in essence that we grow more autonomous in all fields, that we assume greater responsibility for our own security, he is playing directly into the hand of Beijing. When EU Commissioner Thierry Breton talks about the need for the EU to have digital sovereignty from the United States, he is playing into the hands of Beijing. The fact that some EU officials appear to believe that the United States would cut off exports to the EU and therefore it needs strategic de-risking from America boggles the mind. While efforts like the EU-US Trade and Technology Council try to address some of the trade irritants, it is best a sideshow. Until the EU decides which path it wants to take, no bilateral efforts like the TTC will bear real fruit. As such, the EU has three choices. It can seek to continue to engage economically with China and hope to maintain acceptable relations with the United States. The problem with this is, as the German think tank Merix has shown, the negative impacts of the Made in China 2025 plan are likely to be more damaging to the EU than to the United States. As each year goes by, the ability of EU companies to sell in China will deteriorate and the ability of China to sell in Europe will grow, as Europe is now seeing with electric vehicles. Why the EV export surge should have come as a surprise to EU policymakers is truly amazing. Second, the EU can continue to go down its path of strategic de-risking and digital sovereignty, where it sees both China and the United States as equal risks. That path will make joint efforts to limit China's techno-economic aggression hard, if not impossible, and it will result in tens of billions of euros wasted to prop up industries for which the EU is better off relying on from the United States and other allies, and vice versa. Third, deeply aligning with the United States, creating a G2, is the only course that will be effective in countering China. This means the United States and the EU dialing back recent protectionist actions, including U.S. steel tariffs, for which both the Trump and Biden administrations have been completely in the wrong on, and EU digital sovereignty actions that discriminate against U.S. firms. The two regions should, however, go much further and resurrect and pass a transatlantic trade and investment partnership that would eliminate all tariffs on products traded between nations and eliminate most, if not all, regulatory barriers to trade and investment. On top of this, both regions should establish much closer cooperation in areas of science and technology, foreign development assistance, and commercial counterintelligence against China. And most importantly, the two regions should create a demand alliance focused on advanced technologies or inputs which would insulate markets from unfairly produced Chinese goods. This approach is based on reciprocity. The PRC constantly manipulates its market as a tool of statecraft. Joint policies to support this agenda would include tariffs to impose a price floor on Chinese product dumping in sectors such as critical minerals, to enable market-based firms to compete, as well as long-term import restrictions on companies that systematically benefit from unfair trade practices, including closed Chinese markets and excessive subsidization. As much as that is the optimal outcome, its prospects are not good. Too many EU activists are willing to fall on their swords on trivial issues like chlorinated chicken and GMO crops. Will EU leaders have the courage to ignore these radical voices, whose mission is to overthrow market capitalism? Probably not, at least until the threat from Chinese quantum computers becomes clearer than the threat from US chickens. Even without activists gluing themselves to paintings, close EU-US economic relations have always been stymied by Europe's chip on its shoulder. Ever since Jean-Jacques Servan-Schreiber wrote in his 1968 book The American Challenge that the American challenge, U.S. firms like IBM gaining market share and entering Europe, is not ruthless like so many Europe has known in her history, but it may be more dramatic, for it embraces everything the EU has been in a defensive mode towards America. We see this in Europe's decade-long campaign to achieve digital sovereignty as a remedy to digital imperialism. President von der Leyen claimed that it is not too late to achieve technological sovereignty in areas including AI, blockchain, and quantum computing. Commissioner for Internal Market and Services Thierry Breton claimed that EU efforts to do this, including limiting access by U.S. firms, is not a protectionist concept. It is simply about having European technological alternatives in vital areas where we are currently dependent. The EU wants sovereignty, and strangely it sees its democratic ally, the United States, as more of a threat to that sovereignty than the Chinese Communist Party. It is willing to decouple from the United States, but not China. Maybe there's a middle way. At one level, who cares if the American farmers can sell chickens to Europe? Poultry is not strategic. The real question is, can the two regions develop a much more integrated economy in advanced technology industries like semiconductors, drugs, automobiles, machine tools, digital, and others, where they work together to support each other's advanced industry development while limiting China's market access and overall techno-economic advance? Only time will tell, but time is running short.